You've been lied to about what is meant for you. They told you that if you try hard enough, push long enough, and refuse to walk away, anything can be yours. But if that were true, why do the things you force the most feel the most fragile? Why does what you chase keep slipping through your hands, leaving you drained, restless, and quietly defeated? The truth is, if you have to force it, it was never yours to begin with. Buddhist wisdom has whispered this for centuries, that what belongs to you flows toward you without violence, without desperation, without the feeling that you must fight life just to keep it. Tonight, as you listen, something inside you will begin to release. The grip you've held on people, outcomes, and expectations will slowly loosen. The tension in your body will soften. The noise in your mind will slow down, and a strange calm will take its place, like finally setting down a weight you forgot you were carrying. This isn't just about letting go. This is about recognizing what was never meant to stay. Are you ready? Let's begin. Because once you start seeing this truth, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how much of your exhaustion did not come from life itself, but from the constant pushing against it. Not loud pushing, not obvious struggle, but a quiet, relentless pressure you placed on reality to become what you wanted instead of what it was. And this is where the deepest suffering often begins, not in failure, not in loss, but in the moment you decide that what is happening is unacceptable and must be forced into something else. There is a kind of violence that leaves no bruises. No one sees it, no one hears it. Yet it drains more energy than any physical battle ever could. It happens in silence, inside the mind, when you tighten against what is instead of softening into it. It starts subtly, a conversation that doesn't go the way you planned, so you replay it again and again, trying to reshape it in your head. A person who grows distant, so you push harder, text more, explain more, hoping effort can reverse their withdrawal. A goal that refuses to unfold, so you double your pressure, believing strain will produce alignment. None of this looks violent from the outside. It looks like determination. It looks like discipline. It even looks admirable. But inside, something fragile is being crushed. Forcing outcomes is rarely loud. It is quiet insistence. It is waking up already tense because the day must go a certain way. It is feeling a knot in your chest when things drift off script. It is the refusal to allow uncertainty to exist. Over time, the body begins to carry the cost of this resistance. Shoulders stay tight, sleep becomes shallow. Thoughts race even during moments that should feel calm. You may not call it suffering because you have grown used to it, but the body knows. The nervous system knows. It registers the constant message that the present moment is not acceptable. Buddhist teachings often speak of suffering as something created, not imposed. Not something life does to you, but something that forms when you resist the shape of reality. When you force, you are declaring war on what is already happening, and wars, even quiet ones, demand energy. They demand vigilance. They demand that you never relax, because relaxing would mean accepting something you have decided should not be happening. This is why forcing outcomes leads to exhaustion long before visible burnout appears. The fatigue begins internally, not externally. You may still be functioning, still showing up, still completing tasks, but something inside feels worn down. Joy becomes harder to access. Small problems feel heavier than they should. Patience shortens. You may blame circumstances, other people, or even yourself, without realizing that the true drain comes from the ongoing fight with reality itself. There is also a hidden fear inside forcing, a belief that if you stop pushing, everything will collapse, that if you loosen your grip, you will lose control completely. So you keep tightening. You hold relationships tighter, plans tighter, expectations tighter, yet the tighter you hold, the more fragile everything feels. Because force does not create stability, it creates tension. And tension always seeks release, often in ways you cannot predict. Think about how often people say they feel like they are holding their life together with effort alone, as if the moment they stop pushing, everything will fall apart. That is not strength. That is strain mistaken for strength. Real alignment does not require constant pressure. When something fits your life naturally, it moves with you instead of against you. It does not demand that you sacrifice your peace just to keep it alive. Subtle aggression toward reality also distorts perception. When you are forcing something, you begin to interpret every obstacle as an enemy. Neutral events feel personal. Delays feel like attacks. Other people's boundaries feel like rejection. The world starts to look hostile because you are approaching it with tension. It becomes harder to see opportunities, kindness, or unexpected paths because your attention is locked onto making one specific outcome happen. This is why forcing narrows life instead of expanding it. It convinces you that there is only one way forward, one acceptable result, one version of happiness. Anything else feels like failure. But life rarely moves in straight lines. It shifts, bends, pauses, redirects. When you try to control that movement, you end up fighting the very flow that could carry you somewhere better than you planned. Another cost appears in relationships. When you force outcomes with people, they feel it even if you never say it out loud. They sense the pressure to behave a certain way, to respond a certain way, to stay when they may be drifting away. Pressure does not create closeness. It creates distance. It turns connection into obligation. Over time, what you are trying to hold on to begins to slip further away, not because you did something wrong, but because force replaces freedom. There is also a deep loneliness in forcing, because when you are trying to control outcomes, you cannot fully rest in the present moment with others. Your mind is always somewhere else, calculating, adjusting, anticipating. You become physically present but emotionally absent. Even joyful moments feel incomplete because part of you is still managing the future. The irony is that many people force outcomes because they believe it will reduce pain. They think that if they can just make things go their way, the anxiety will stop. But forcing creates its own pain, one that lingers quietly in the background. It steals the ability to enjoy what is already working because attention is fixed on what is not. Buddhist reflection invites a different approach, not passive resignation, but gentle participation in reality as it unfolds. Instead of gripping, you observe. Instead of pushing, you respond. Instead of demanding certainty, you allow space for the unknown. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop wounding yourself with resistance. There is a moment many people experience when they finally stop forcing something. A relationship they stop trying to fix alone. A goal they release after years of strain. An identity they no longer feel obligated to maintain. At first, it feels terrifying, like stepping into empty space. But then something unexpected happens. The body relaxes, breathing deepens, thoughts slow down, energy returns in ways it has not for a long time. This relief reveals how much pressure was being carried. It also reveals something else. That life continues without your constant interference. The sun still rises, conversations still happen, opportunities still appear. In fact, new possibilities often emerge once the old struggle ends. Possibilities that could not be seen while your vision was narrowed by force. Subtle aggression toward reality also blocks intuition. When you are forcing, you are not listening. You override quiet signals that something is misaligned because you are focused on achieving the outcome you decided must happen. But the body and mind often know before you admit it. The tension, the unease, the sense that something is off even when everything looks fine on paper. These are not weaknesses. They are guidance systems trying to redirect you. Ignoring them requires effort, constant effort, and that effort accumulates as fatigue. Many people do not realize how much of their exhaustion comes from living in misalignment rather than from the actual tasks of life. Two people can work equally hard, yet one feels energized while the other feels drained. The difference is not always the workload, it is whether their effort flows with reality or against it. Forcing outcomes also keeps you attached to timelines that may not belong to you. You decide when something should happen, how fast it should unfold, how it should look. When reality does not comply, frustration builds. But life operates on a rhythm that cannot be rushed without consequences. Growth, healing, connection, understanding, these processes resist acceleration. They require space, patience, and sometimes stillness. Stillness is uncomfortable for someone used to forcing. It feels like doing nothing, like losing ground. But stillness is often where clarity returns. It is where you can finally hear the quiet truth that was drowned out by constant pushing. There is also a deeper layer to this violence. It is not only aggression toward reality, but toward yourself. When you force, you send a message that your current experience is unacceptable, that you must constantly fix, improve, control, or escape. This creates a chronic sense of insufficiency, as if you are always behind, always not enough, always needing to catch up to a version of life that exists only in your expectations. Letting go of force does not mean abandoning effort. It means choosing effort that feels alive instead of effort that feels suffocating. There is a difference between moving forward and dragging yourself forward. One expands you, the other depletes you. Peace begins not when everything becomes perfect, but when the internal war ends. When you stop treating reality as an opponent and start meeting it as it is. This does not make you passive. It makes you responsive instead of reactive. You still act, still care, still build, but without the underlying tension that turns action into struggle. Over time, this shift changes how you experience life. Challenges feel lighter because you are no longer fighting both the situation and your resistance to it. Relationships feel easier because you are not trying to control how others feel. Goals feel meaningful again because they are chosen from alignment rather than desperation. The quietest transformation is the return of energy. Not explosive motivation, not adrenaline, but steady, calm vitality. The kind that does not disappear at the first obstacle. The kind that allows you to move through life without feeling like you are constantly pushing a heavy weight uphill. And perhaps the most surprising realization is this. Many of the things you were forcing were never meant to stay, not as punishment, not as failure, but as redirection. Life was not resisting you. It was guiding you away from what would have cost you even more in the long run. When you stop forcing, you begin to see which doors open without struggle, which conversations flow naturally, which opportunities arrive without chasing. These are not coincidences. They are signs of alignment, of movement that does not require violence to sustain. This is why the first step in letting go is not action, but awareness. Seeing the cost of forcing clearly, recognizing the tension, the exhaustion, the quiet suffering it creates. Once you see it, the desire to continue disappears on its own. You no longer need to convince yourself to let go. Your body will want to. And in that moment, something softens, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because you are no longer making it harder than it already is. This is where real peace begins. Not in controlling outcomes, not in winning battles, but in stepping out of the war you were never meant to fight. And once the war inside begins to quiet, another truth slowly rises to the surface. The exhaustion was not only coming from forcing life, it was also coming from the belief that struggle itself is what made you valuable. When you stop pushing against everything, a strange discomfort appears, not because something is wrong, but because you no longer recognize yourself without the tension. There is a moment when peace finally becomes possible, yet instead of relief, you feel uneasy, as if calmness is suspicious, as if ease must mean you are doing something wrong. It reveals something deeper than effort. It reveals attachment to effort as an identity. For some people, rest feels more threatening than struggle. Stillness feels like emptiness. Ease feels like cheating. When your entire sense of worth has been built on how much you endure, how much you sacrifice, how hard you push, peace begins to feel undeserved. Letting go does not feel like freedom. It feels like failure. This attachment often begins early. Many were praised only when they worked harder than everyone else, endured more than everyone else, stayed longer, gave more, tolerated more. Effort became the language of love and approval. Without realizing it, the mind learned a quiet equation. If I am not struggling, I am not worthy. If I am not exhausted, I am not trying hard enough. If things become easy, I must be losing my edge. Over time, struggle stops being a phase and becomes a personality. You become the strong one, the reliable one, the one who never quits, the one who carries more than anyone should. People admire you for it. They depend on you for it. And slowly, you start depending on it too, not because you enjoy suffering, but because you no longer know who you are without it. This is why letting go feels dangerous. Not because you want pain, but because pain has become familiar. It has become proof that you are still fighting, still valuable, still relevant. When peace arrives, it does not feel like a reward. It feels like losing your purpose. Attachment to effort also creates a fear of being seen as lazy or weak. Even when no one is judging you, an internal voice keeps whispering that you should be doing more, pushing more, proving more. Rest becomes something you must justify instead of something you are allowed to have. Joy feels temporary, as if it must be earned again through difficulty. This is especially true for people who built their identity around survival. When life required constant resilience, calmness did not exist as an option. So when circumstances finally allow softness, the nervous system does not trust it. It stays alert, waiting for the next crisis, ready to return to the familiar role of the fighter. There is also a subtle pride hidden in effort, a sense of superiority that comes from being able to endure what others cannot. It feels empowering at first, like armor that protects you from vulnerability. But armor also prevents closeness, prevents rest, prevents ease. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you isolated. When struggle becomes identity, relationships can suffer in ways that are hard to notice. You may feel uncomfortable receiving help because you are used to being the one who gives. You may reject kindness because it disrupts the role you have always played. You may even choose situations that require constant effort because they confirm the story you tell yourself about who you are. Peace, on the other hand, requires you to exist without performance. It asks you to be rather than prove. It removes the familiar markers that told you were doing enough. Without struggle, you may wonder what remains. Who am I if I am not fighting something? What is my value if I am not overcoming obstacles? This is where letting go begins to feel like losing yourself. Not because you actually are, but because you are shedding a version of yourself that was built on survival rather than alignment. Buddhist reflection teaches that clinging to any identity creates suffering, even identities that seem admirable. The identity of the hard-working one, the resilient one, the one who never stops, these can become cages disguised as strengths. They keep you trapped in patterns long after they stop serving you. Another hidden cost appears in how you approach goals. When effort is identity, you may choose the hardest path even when a simpler one exists. Not consciously, but because ease feels unfamiliar. You may distrust opportunities that come naturally because they do not match the narrative of struggle you are used to. Success without suffering can feel undeserved, as if you skipped something important. This mindset also keeps people tied to situations they have already outgrown. Walking away feels like admitting that all the effort invested was wasted. So they stay, not because the situation is right, but because leaving would mean redefining who they are. It would mean accepting that value does not come from endurance alone. There is also grief in releasing the identity of the struggler. It may have protected you. It may have carried you through times when there was no other choice. Letting it go can feel like abandoning a part of your history. But growth often requires honoring what once saved you, while recognizing that it no longer needs to define you. Peace does not erase strength. It reveals a different kind of strength, one that does not require constant tension, one that allows softness without collapsing, one that trusts that worth is not measured by exhaustion. When people begin to detach from effort as identity, they often discover how much life they missed while they were busy proving themselves. Moments of quiet joy, simple connection, spontaneous creativity, things that cannot survive in an environment of constant pressure. They realize that presence was sacrificed for performance. The body also responds to this shift. Chronic tension begins to release. Breathing deepens. Sleep improves. Energy becomes steadier instead of fluctuating between adrenaline and burnout. The nervous system learns that it does not have to stay in survival mode to feel safe. Yet the transition is not immediate. There may be periods where you feel lost, unsure of how to move without the old drive. Motivation may change shape, becoming less frantic and more intentional. At first, this slower rhythm can feel like stagnation, but it is actually recalibration. You are learning how to act without self-violence. Another realization emerges during this process. Many of the things you achieved through force did not bring the fulfillment you expected, not because the achievements were meaningless, but because the motivation behind them was rooted in proving worth rather than expressing truth. When effort shifts from proving to expressing, actions feel lighter, even when they are challenging. This is the difference between effort and strain. Effort aligned with purpose energizes. Strain driven by identity depletes. One moves you forward, the other keeps you trapped in cycles of exhaustion. Letting go of attachment to effort also allows you to receive life instead of constantly trying to shape it. Opportunities, relationships, and insights begin to arrive without being chased. You start noticing how much unfolds naturally when you stop gripping everything so tightly. There is also a quiet humility in releasing the need to prove. You no longer need to be the strongest in the room, the most resilient, the one who never breaks. You allow yourself to be human, to need rest, to ask for support, to exist without performing strength. This humility does not make you smaller, it makes you real. And reality, when not resisted, has a way of carrying you toward what fits without demanding constant effort. Eventually, peace stops feeling undeserved. It begins to feel like a home you forgot you were allowed to return to. You realize that worth was never meant to be earned through suffering alone. It was always present, waiting for you to stop running long enough to notice it. Letting go, then, is not failure. It is the courage to exist without the armor of struggle. It is the willingness to discover who you are when you are no longer defined by how much you can endure. And in that discovery, something unexpected appears. Not weakness, not emptiness, but a quiet strength that does not need to prove itself to anyone, including you. This is where the identity of effort dissolves, making space for a life that no longer requires constant struggle to feel meaningful. And when the identity built on struggle begins to loosen, another fear rises quietly from underneath it. If effort is no longer proving your worth, if pushing is no longer holding your life together, then what happens when you finally open your hands? What happens when you stop gripping the very things that have been hurting you? A strange panic appears, not because you want the pain, but because you fear the emptiness that might follow its absence. It is the fear of having nothing to hold, nothing to fix, nothing to chase. The fear that if you release what was never meant to stay, you will be left with silence instead of relief. Sometimes the weight in your hands hurts, yet you keep holding it because the idea of empty hands feels even more frightening. There is a moment that comes after letting go when everything goes quiet. No more tension to manage, no more problem to solve, no more familiar struggle to occupy your thoughts. At first, this quiet does not feel peaceful. It feels exposed. It feels like standing in an open space without walls, without noise, without distractions. The mind begins searching desperately for something to grab onto, even if that something was the very source of suffering. This fear of empty hands is deeply human. Holding on to pain at least feels like holding on to something. Pain has shape, it has familiarity, it gives the illusion of control because it is known. Emptiness, on the other hand, feels unpredictable. It forces you into uncertainty, into a space where you do not yet know what will replace what you released. Many people stay attached to relationships, ambitions, roles, and identities long after they stop nourishing them, not because they believe they are good, but because they fear the void that might follow their absence. The mind whispers that something is better than nothing, even when that something slowly erodes your peace. This fear often begins in moments of loss earlier in life. When something important disappeared unexpectedly, the nervous system learned that emptiness equals danger. It equated absence with abandonment, with instability, with the possibility that nothing safe would come next. From that point forward, the instinct became simple. Hold on at all costs, even if what you are holding cuts into your skin. Letting go then feels like stepping toward a cliff. Not because you want to fall, but because you cannot see what lies beyond the edge. The mind imagines worst-case scenarios. What if nothing better comes? What if you regret it? What if you end up alone? These questions create a kind of paralysis, keeping you tied to what hurts simply because it is predictable. There is also a deep link between empty hands and identity. If something has been part of your life for a long time, it becomes intertwined with who you believe you are. Releasing it can feel like erasing a piece of yourself. Even if that piece brought more pain than joy, it still feels like losing a familiar reflection in the mirror. This is why people sometimes return to situations they know are unhealthy. Not because they have forgotten the pain, but because the absence of that pain feels disorienting. It is easier to return to a known discomfort than to sit with an unknown quiet. The body reacts to this fear in subtle ways. Restlessness appears without clear reason. Sleep becomes uneasy. Thoughts loop around the same questions. You may even create new problems unconsciously just to fill the space that opened up. The nervous system is trying to restore familiarity, even if that familiarity was suffering. Buddhist insight teaches that attachment is not only about clinging to pleasure, but also about clinging to pain. Both provide a sense of solidity in a world that is constantly changing. Empty hands represent impermanence in its purest form. They remind you that nothing can be permanently secured, that life flows through phases whether you resist or not. Yet empty hands are not truly empty, they are simply unoccupied. They are space waiting to be filled with something that does not require force. But this truth is hard to trust when you have lived in survival mode, when you have learned to depend only on what you can hold tightly. There is also a cultural layer to this fear. Many societies teach that value comes from accumulation of achievements, possessions, relationships, recognition. Letting go looks like losing status, losing progress, losing evidence that your efforts mattered. Empty hands can feel like starting over, and starting over feels exhausting when you have already carried so much. But there is another perspective. Empty hands are also hands that are no longer carrying what was breaking them. They are hands that can finally rest, hands that can receive instead of only grasping. Hands that are open to possibilities that could never enter while they were closed around something else. The transition from holding to openness is uncomfortable because it requires trust without guarantees. You must believe that life is not punishing you with emptiness, but creating space for something aligned to arrive. This belief does not come instantly. It grows slowly through experience, through noticing that every release in the past eventually led to a new beginning, even if it did not look the way you expected. Grief is often part of this process. Not only grief for what you lost, but grief for the version of yourself that invested so much in it. Grief acknowledges that something mattered, that it shaped you, that it was real even if it was not meant to last. Allowing this grief softens the fear because it validates the emotional weight you carried. Another layer of panic comes from the illusion that you must immediately replace what you released, as if empty space is unacceptable unless it is quickly filled. But some spaces are meant to remain open for a while. They allow recalibration. They allow clarity to return. Filling them too quickly can recreate the same patterns you just escaped. Learning to sit with empty hands is learning to sit with uncertainty. It is learning that not knowing is not the same as being unsafe. It is discovering that peace can exist without constant stimulation, without constant direction, without constant reassurance. This stillness reveals how much of life was spent reacting instead of choosing. When your hands are full, you cannot see clearly what you are carrying. When they are empty, you finally have the chance to decide intentionally what deserves to be picked up again. There is also freedom in realizing that you are not required to replace everything you release. Some things leave to create space, not to be substituted. The absence itself becomes the gift. More time, more energy, more emotional capacity, more room for authenticity. Over time, the fear softens. The emptiness that once felt threatening begins to feel peaceful. Silence stops sounding like loneliness and starts sounding like relief. You notice details you missed before, small joys that were overshadowed by constant tension. Life becomes quieter, but also clearer. Eventually, you understand that empty hands are not a sign of loss, but a sign of readiness. Readiness to live without clinging, without forcing, without trying to secure permanence in a world that moves. You become less afraid of change because you no longer depend on any single thing to define your stability. This shift does not remove vulnerability. You still care, you still feel, but you are no longer terrified of absence. You trust that your worth does not disappear when something leaves. You trust that what is truly aligned cannot be taken by letting go. The most surprising realization is that empty hands can hold peace more easily than hands full of struggle ever could. Peace does not require gripping, it requires openness. And in that openness, something gentle begins to return. Not the old tension, not the old urgency, but a quiet confidence that you can survive uncertainty without clinging to pain just to feel secure. You realize that you were never meant to hold everything forever. Some things were meant to pass through your hands, teaching you how to release without losing yourself in the process. And once you learn this, the fear begins to fade, replaced by a calm understanding that empty hands are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a different way of living, one where peace does not depend on what you hold, but on your willingness to let life move without gripping it in fear. As the fear of empty hands begins to soften, another hidden pattern starts to reveal itself. You realize that it was not only the emptiness you feared, it was also the unfamiliar peace that came with it. Because when pain has been present for a long time, it stops feeling like an intruder and starts feeling like part of the structure of your life. Without it, you do not immediately feel free. You feel disoriented. There is a quiet danger in what the mind recognizes. It trusts what it has seen before, even if what it has seen before has caused harm. Sometimes what hurts feels safer than what heals, simply because it is known. There is a reason people return to the same kinds of situations, the same kinds of relationships, the same kinds of disappointments, even after promising themselves they will choose differently. It is not because they enjoy suffering, it is because familiarity creates a false sense of safety. The brain relaxes when it recognizes patterns, even painful ones. The unknown requires alertness, but the familiar allows autopilot, even if that autopilot leads back into the same storms. Pain that repeats begins to look like destiny. When something happens often enough, the mind stops questioning it and starts accepting it as inevitable. It begins to say, "This is just how life is for me. This is the kind of love I get. This is the level of peace I am allowed to have." These quiet conclusions form slowly, without drama, until they become invisible rules guiding every decision. Mistaking familiar pain for destiny is not a conscious choice. It is an adaptation. When the nervous system learns that certain patterns are unavoidable, it stops resisting them to conserve energy. Acceptance becomes a survival strategy, not a sign of wisdom. But this kind of acceptance is heavy. It carries resignation instead of peace. One of the strongest examples appears in relationships. A person who grew up around emotional distance may later feel uneasy around warmth. Kindness can feel suspicious. Consistency can feel boring. They may gravitate toward partners who are unpredictable, not because they enjoy instability, but because unpredictability is what their body recognizes as love. Stability feels foreign, and foreign feels unsafe. The same pattern appears in how people relate to stress. Someone used to constant pressure may feel restless during calm periods. When life slows down, anxiety rises, not because something is wrong, but because the absence of tension feels unnatural. They may unconsciously create new stress just to restore the familiar state of urgency their body associates with normal. Work, too, becomes a place where familiar pain disguises itself as purpose. A person who learned early that worth comes from overexertion may choose environments that demand constant sacrifice. They may pride themselves on endurance while quietly burning out. When presented with healthier alternatives, they may reject them, feeling that ease equals laziness, even if the new path would support their well-being. This is how the mind protects itself from uncertainty. It clings to known discomfort rather than risk unknown possibilities. The logic is simple, but flawed. At least I know how to survive this pain. New territory offers no guarantees. Buddhist teachings speak of attachment not only to pleasure but also to suffering. Suffering becomes an anchor, something solid in a world that feels unpredictable. Releasing it requires stepping into a space where identity, expectations, and habits no longer provide direction. That openness can feel like drifting without a map. There is also a subtle narrative that forms around repeated pain. People begin to build stories about themselves that revolve around endurance. They see themselves as the one who is always overlooked, always betrayed, always struggling. These stories become lenses through which every new experience is filtered. Evidence that contradicts them is ignored, while evidence that confirms them is magnified. Over time, the story feels more real than the present moment. Familiar pain also shapes tolerance levels. When you are used to discomfort, you may accept behavior that others would reject immediately. You may minimize harm, telling yourself it is not that bad, that you have handled worse. This tolerance keeps you in cycles that could have ended earlier if unfamiliar peace had not felt so unsettling. Another layer of this pattern appears in self-talk. The voice inside may repeat phrases learned long ago, phrases that once protected you but now limit you. words that suggest you should not expect too much, should not trust too easily, should not hope too openly. These messages reinforce the idea that pain is not only normal but necessary. Breaking this cycle requires noticing the difference between recognition and alignment. Just because something feels familiar does not mean it belongs in your life. Familiarity is not proof of destiny, it is proof of repetition. The body often signals this mismatch before the mind admits it. A heaviness when entering certain spaces. A subtle dread before interactions that should feel neutral. A sense of shrinking instead of expanding. These signals are easy to ignore because they do not shout, they whisper. But they are important because they reveal the cost of staying in patterns that no longer serve you. Letting go of familiar pain can feel like betraying your past. It can bring guilt, as if you are abandoning the struggles that shaped you. But growth does not erase history. It integrates it while choosing a different future. You do not dishonor your past by refusing to repeat it. You honor it by learning from it. There is also grief in realizing how much time was spent believing pain was unavoidable. Grief for the opportunities missed because you did not believe something better was possible. Grief for the relationships that ended the same way because you did not know another kind of connection existed. Allowing this grief is part of healing because it releases the illusion that destiny was controlling your path. Once you start recognizing these patterns, a new kind of awareness emerges. You begin to pause before stepping into situations that feel too familiar. You question automatic reactions. You notice the pull toward what hurts and ask whether it is truly aligned or simply recognized. This pause creates space for choice. Choice is what transforms repetition into evolution. Without awareness, patterns repeat endlessly. With awareness, they become optional. The first experiences of unfamiliar peace may feel strange. You may find yourself waiting for something to go wrong, scanning for signs that the calm will disappear. Trust takes time to rebuild because it was eroded by past disappointments. But gradually, the nervous system learns that stability does not have to be temporary, that calm does not have to be followed by chaos. You begin to experience relationships that do not require constant repair, work that does not demand self-sacrifice, rest that does not trigger guilt. These experiences feel almost unreal at first, like stepping into a life that belongs to someone else. But with time, they start to feel natural. Another shift happens internally. You stop interpreting discomfort as proof of depth. You realize that suffering is not a badge of honor. It does not make you more authentic or more deserving. It simply signals that something is misaligned. The mind, once addicted to familiar pain, begins to appreciate stability. Predictability stops feeling boring and starts feeling peaceful. Emotional safety becomes attractive instead of suspicious. You discover that life can be meaningful without constant struggle. This transformation also changes how you see others. You become more compassionate, recognizing that many people are not choosing pain consciously. They are repeating what they know because it feels safer than exploring the unknown. This understanding replaces judgment with empathy. There is also empowerment in realizing that destiny is not determined by what you endured, but by what you choose next. Familiar pain loses its authority once you see it clearly. It becomes a memory instead of a guide. Eventually, the idea that suffering is inevitable begins to dissolve. You start noticing moments of genuine ease, moments where nothing needs to be fixed or endured. These moments expand, not because life becomes perfect, but because your perception changes. You stop searching for problems and start allowing peace to exist without questioning it. This is not naive optimism. It is a grounded acceptance that pain will come and go, but it does not have to define your path. You are not required to relive the same wounds to prove your resilience. You can choose experiences that nourish instead of deplete. The most liberating realization is that recognition is not destiny. You can acknowledge where you have been without returning there. You can honor your survival without staying in survival mode forever. As this understanding settles, something inside relaxes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The pull toward familiar pain weakens. The attraction to what supports your well-being strengthens. You begin to trust yourself in a new way, not as someone who can endure anything, but as someone who can choose differently. And in that choice, a new path appears. Not one built on repetition, not one defined by suffering, but one shaped by awareness, intention, and the quiet courage to step away from what once felt inevitable. This is how destiny changes, not through force, but through the willingness to stop mistaking what is familiar for what is meant for you. As the illusion of familiar pain begins to loosen its grip, another pattern comes into view, quieter but just as binding. You start to notice that not everything that keeps you stuck is openly painful. Some situations do not hurt enough to force you to leave, yet they never feel whole enough to give you peace. They exist in a strange middle space, neither fulfilling nor completely broken. It is the space of almost. Almost happy, almost chosen, almost successful, almost healed, almost free. And because it is not entirely unbearable, you remain there longer than you should. There is a peculiar kind of attachment that forms around things that nearly work. When something is completely wrong, walking away becomes easier because the clarity is undeniable. But when something occasionally feels right, when there are moments of warmth, moments of progress, moments of hope, the mind holds on to those fragments as proof that the whole situation can still become what you need it to be. This is how people stay trapped in cycles that never resolve, not because they are weak, but because uncertainty mixed with occasional reward creates powerful attachment. The mind starts chasing the good moments, believing that if it tries harder, waits longer, adjusts more, those moments will become permanent. Situations that are almost right keep you suspended between hope and disappointment. You never fully relax because something is always missing, yet you never fully detach because something is always present. It becomes emotionally exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain because from the outside it does not look like suffering. It looks like patience, loyalty, perseverance, but inside there is constant tension. Relationships are one of the most common places where this addiction appears. When someone gives affection inconsistently, when connection feels strong one day and distant the next, the unpredictability itself becomes addictive. The mind keeps replaying the moments when things felt perfect, convincing you that those moments represent the true version of the relationship, while the painful moments are temporary distortions. This creates a loop where you wait for the return of something that was never stable to begin with. You tell yourself that if you just hold on, communicate better, change your approach, the balance will shift permanently, yet the cycle repeats, leaving you drained but still invested. The same pattern happens with goals. A project that shows promise but never fully materializes. A career path that offers glimpses of satisfaction but mostly frustration. You stay because you have already invested time and energy, and walking away would mean acknowledging that the payoff may never come. This is where the addiction deepens. Effort creates emotional investment, and investment makes detachment feel like loss, even if the situation itself has been quietly draining you for years. There is also a psychological mechanism at play. Humans are wired to respond strongly to intermittent rewards. When something good happens unpredictably, it becomes more compelling than something that is consistently pleasant. The unpredictability keeps you engaged, scanning for the next positive moment, hoping it will arrive sooner this time. Over time, you become attached not only to the situation, but to the anticipation itself. Waiting becomes part of your identity. You begin to measure time by how long you have endured, how long you have believed, how long you have stayed despite uncertainty. Another layer appears when you start linking your self-worth to the outcome. Leaving begins to feel like admitting that your effort did not change anything. Staying allows you to preserve the narrative that persistence will eventually be rewarded. It protects you from confronting the possibility that some things are not meant to be fixed by effort alone. There is also fear of the unknown after leaving the almost. Even though the current situation is unsatisfying, it is familiar. You know its rhythms, its disappointments, its brief highs. Stepping away means entering territory where nothing is guaranteed, where you must rebuild without the comfort of familiarity. This fear often keeps people in situations long after their intuition has told them it is time to move on. The mind invents reasons to stay. It tells stories about potential, about timing, about the idea that quitting now would waste everything you have already endured. But the cost of staying in almost is rarely visible all at once. It accumulates slowly. Opportunities pass because you are emotionally unavailable. Energy drains because you are constantly managing uncertainty. Joy fades because part of you is always waiting for something to change. You may also begin to lower your standards without realizing it. What once felt unacceptable becomes tolerable. What once felt insufficient becomes enough. Not because your needs changed, but because you adapted to scarcity. Buddhist reflection highlights the suffering created by attachment to outcomes that never arrive. The mind clings to the idea of completion, believing that closure will bring peace. But almost situations rarely provide closure. They fade slowly or drag on indefinitely, keeping you tethered to something unfinished. There is also a subtle illusion that the almost is safer than nothing. You tell yourself that partial connection is better than loneliness, partial success is better than starting over, partial clarity is better than uncertainty. Yet this half-state prevents you from experiencing the fullness that becomes possible only after release. Breaking free from the addiction to almost requires confronting the discomfort of finality. It means accepting that some chapters will not conclude neatly, that some questions will remain unanswered. It means trusting that clarity can come after the ending, not before. When people finally step away from almost situations, the first emotion is often not relief but grief. Grief for what could have been. Grief for the time invested. Grief for the hope that kept them there. This grief is necessary because it acknowledges the emotional reality of the attachment. After grief comes a quieter feeling, one that may go unnoticed at first. Space. Space that was previously occupied by waiting. Space that allows new experiences to enter. Space that lets you reconnect with parts of yourself that were neglected while you were focused on making something work. With time, you begin to see how much life was paused while you were living in almost. How many decisions were postponed. How many risks were avoided. How much of your identity was tied to a situation that never fully supported you. There is also a return of clarity. Without the constant emotional noise of uncertainty, your perception sharpens. You notice what genuinely aligns with you and what only resembles alignment on the surface. You become less willing to settle for fragments when you know wholeness is possible. The body responds as well. Chronic tension eases, sleep deepens, energy stabilizes. The nervous system, no longer trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment, begins to trust consistency again. Eventually, you reach a point where almost no longer feels acceptable. Not because you have become demanding, but because you have remembered what genuine peace feels like. You realize that fulfillment does not require perfection, but it does require stability, honesty, and mutual presence. This shift changes how you approach future situations. You become more attentive to early signs of imbalance. You trust your discomfort instead of dismissing it. You choose environments that nourish rather than deplete. The most profound realization is that almost was not keeping you close to what you wanted. It was keeping you far from it. By occupying your time, energy, and emotional capacity, it prevented you from seeking or recognizing something fully aligned. Letting go of almost is not about rejecting imperfection. It is about refusing to live indefinitely in a state of incompleteness that drains more than it gives. It is about honoring your need for wholeness, even if reaching it requires stepping into uncertainty first. When you finally release the almost, you may discover that life does not collapse. It expands. New connections form, new paths appear, new insights emerge, not because you forced them, but because you created space for them. And in that space, you begin to understand that what is truly meant for you does not leave you guessing, waiting, or negotiating for scraps of fulfillment. It meets you fully, not almost. It stays without needing constant repair. It feels calm instead of confusing. And once you experience that kind of alignment, the addiction to almost loses its hold, replaced by a quiet certainty that you no longer need to settle for fragments when your life has room for something whole. When you finally release the grip on what was only almost, another discomfort appears, quieter but deeply unsettling. You begin to realize that not everything in life ends with clarity. Not every connection offers an explanation. Not every chapter closes with words, apologies, or understanding. Some things simply loosen their hold and drift away without ceremony. And this lack of resolution can feel harder than conflict itself. There is a deep human urge to make sense of endings, to name them, analyze them, frame them in a way that feels complete. Without that sense of completion, the mind keeps circling back, searching for the missing piece that will allow it to move on peacefully. It wants a final conversation, a final reason, a final confirmation that what happened had meaning. But not all endings are meant to be explained. Some are meant to dissolve. There is a kind of suffering that comes from trying to force closure where life is offering quiet release instead. You ask questions that no one can answer. You replay events, trying to locate the exact moment when everything changed. You imagine conversations that might bring relief, believing that if you could just understand, you could finally rest. This pursuit can keep you tied to something long after it has already faded from reality. Forcing closure often comes from the belief that peace requires resolution, that you cannot move forward until everything makes sense. But life does not operate like a story with neat conclusions. Many experiences end without explanation because their purpose was not to be understood intellectually, but to be felt, lived, and eventually released. Buddhist reflection teaches that impermanence is not only about physical change, but also about emotional fading. Just as seasons shift without asking permission, relationships, identities, and phases of life transform without always providing reasons. Trying to hold them in place or extract meaning beyond what is naturally revealed creates additional suffering. There is also an ego component in the need for closure. The mind resists uncertainty because uncertainty feels like loss of control. Knowing why something ended restores a sense of order, even if the truth is painful. Not knowing leaves a gap that cannot be filled with logic, forcing you to sit with ambiguity. Ambiguity is uncomfortable because it demands trust without proof. It asks you to believe that life can continue meaningfully even when some questions remain unanswered. It challenges the idea that every experience must be neatly categorized as success or failure, right or wrong, deserved or undeserved. In many cases, forcing closure reopens wounds that were beginning to heal naturally, reaching out for explanations, revisiting past environments, searching for validation from people who have already moved on. These actions pull you back into emotional spaces that time was slowly softening. The healing process resets, not because you wanted pain, but because you believed resolution required confrontation. Some endings are not meant to be confronted, they are meant to be allowed. Allowing dissolution means recognizing when something is already fading and choosing not to interfere with that process. It is the opposite of forcing. Instead of chasing answers, you step back and let the experience lose its intensity on its own. Memories become less sharp. Emotional reactions become less immediate. What once felt overwhelming becomes distant. This natural fading is often mistaken for avoidance, but it is actually acceptance in motion. It acknowledges that not everything needs to be dissected to be released. Another challenge arises when you confuse closure with validation. You may believe that if someone acknowledges your pain or admits their role in it, you will finally feel at peace. While validation can be comforting, tying your healing to another person's response gives them continued influence over your inner state. True closure comes from within, not from someone else's understanding. There is also grief in accepting that you may never receive the answers you hoped for. Grief for the imagined conversation that would have brought clarity. Grief for the belief that everything meaningful ends with mutual recognition. Allowing this grief is part of dissolving attachment to the idea that closure must be earned. Over time, you begin to see that clarity often arrives indirectly, not through explanations but through distance. As you move forward, new experiences provide perspective that was impossible while you were still inside the situation. What once felt confusing becomes obvious. What once felt personal begins to look like part of a larger pattern. Distance reveals truths that analysis could not. There is also a subtle freedom in not knowing everything. When you stop demanding complete understanding, you allow life to remain complex and open-ended. You no longer need every experience to fit into a tidy narrative. You accept that some things existed simply to shape you, not to be explained. This shift changes how you relate to future endings as well. You become less desperate for finality, more willing to let things unfold naturally. You trust that closure will come in its own form, even if that form is quiet detachment rather than dramatic resolution. The body responds to this acceptance. Tension that was fueled by constant rumination begins to ease. Sleep improves because the mind is no longer replaying scenarios late into the night. Emotional stability returns because you are no longer oscillating between hope for answers and frustration at their absence. Another transformation occurs in how you see time. When you are chasing closure, you feel stuck in the past. When you allow dissolution, time begins to flow again. You re-engage with the present moment instead of mentally revisiting what is no longer happening. There is also humility in accepting that you may never fully understand certain experiences. This humility softens the need to control life through interpretation. It opens space for curiosity instead of certainty, for reflection instead of fixation. Eventually, you realize that closure is not a door someone else must close for you. It is a process of releasing your grip on the need for explanation. It is the willingness to let unanswered questions exist without letting them dominate your peace. Dissolution, unlike forced closure, is gentle. It does not demand action. It unfolds gradually as you redirect your attention toward what is alive in your life now. New connections, new interests, new insights slowly replace the space once occupied by the past. What once felt unfinished stops feeling urgent. The memory remains, but it no longer defines your emotional landscape. There is also a deeper lesson hidden here. Not everything ends because it was broken. Some things end because their purpose was temporary. They were meant to intersect with your life for a period of time and then fade as you evolved. Trying to preserve them beyond that period creates resistance against natural change. When you allow dissolution, you honor the role something played without insisting that it remain forever. You acknowledge that value does not require permanence. This perspective reduces fear of future endings. You stop seeing them as failures and start seeing them as transitions. Each phase prepares you for the next, even if the connection between them is not immediately visible. Peace arrives not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet absence of urgency. You stop checking for signs, stop rehearsing conversations, stop searching for hidden meanings. You feel grounded in the present because you are no longer mentally negotiating with the past. In that grounded state, gratitude can emerge. Gratitude for what existed, even if it did not last. Gratitude for the lessons learned, even if they were painful. Gratitude for the fact that life continues to move, offering new possibilities that would not exist if everything remained unchanged. This is the wisdom of allowing things to fade. Not every story needs a final chapter written in bold letters. Some stories end in soft ink, gradually disappearing from the page as new words take their place. And when you accept this, you discover a deeper form of closure, one that does not rely on explanations or approval, but on your ability to release without needing the ending to make sense. In that release, the past loosens its hold, the present becomes lighter, and the future opens quietly, without pressure, without force, simply waiting for you to step into it, with hands no longer clenched around what has already dissolved. As you begin to accept that some things dissolve without explanation, another realization surfaces, one that is harder to admit because it touches pride. Not every struggle continues because of love, purpose, or hope. Some struggles continue because the ego refuses to walk away without winning. Even when the battle itself has stopped making sense, something inside insists on staying until victory is declared. And yet there are battles that were never meant to be won, only understood. There is a quiet discomfort that appears when you consider stepping away from something unfinished. A voice inside asks what it will say about you if you leave, whether it will look like weakness, failure, or defeat. This voice does not care about peace. It cares about image, about the story you tell yourself about who you are. Pride can turn suffering into a competition you refuse to lose. The ego thrives on comparison and validation. It wants to prove that you were right, that you tried harder, that you endured more, that you deserved a different outcome. It clings to the belief that persistence guarantees resolution, even when reality has already moved on. Walking away feels like admitting that effort alone could not change everything. This is why people stay locked in conflicts long after the original issue has faded. Arguments that could have ended quietly continue because neither side wants to concede. The need to be right becomes more important than the possibility of peace. Even silence can become a battleground, a refusal to acknowledge that the fight itself has lost meaning. In relationships, this pattern often appears as the refusal to let go of someone who has already emotionally left. Instead of grieving and releasing, the ego shifts into recovery mode, determined to restore what was lost. Not necessarily because the connection is still healthy, but because losing feels like losing status, losing identity, losing proof that you were valued. The ego interprets rejection as a challenge to be reversed rather than a message to be heard. There is also a deep fear of irrelevance hidden inside this obsession. If the battle ends without victory, what was all that effort for? What was all that pain for? The ego wants a narrative that justifies the struggle. Without it, the experience feels wasted, and wasted effort threatens the identity built around endurance and resilience. But some battles exist only to show you the limits of control. They reveal that not everything can be fixed through determination. They expose the illusion that effort equals entitlement. In Buddhist reflection, surrender is not defeat but clarity. It is the recognition that fighting reality only deepens suffering. The difficulty is that surrender does not provide the dramatic satisfaction of victory. It is quiet, almost invisible. No applause, no acknowledgement, no clear moment where you can say the struggle was resolved. It feels anticlimactic compared to the intensity of the fight. Yet within that quiet lies relief that victory could never provide. Another reason the ego resists surrender is because it confuses letting go with losing value. It believes that if you stop trying, you stop mattering. But value is not measured by how long you stay in a losing battle. It is measured by your ability to recognize when a path no longer leads anywhere meaningful. This realization requires humility. Humility is uncomfortable because it strips away the protective layers of pride. It asks you to accept that you do not control everything, that you are not always meant to prevail, that sometimes wisdom lies in stepping back rather than pushing forward. There is also anger embedded in the ego's resistance. Anger at injustice, at unmet expectations, at the idea that life did not reward your effort in the way you believed it should. This anger can fuel continued struggle long after it stops serving any constructive purpose. It keeps you emotionally tied to something that has already ended physically. Over time, this attachment to winning can distort your perception. You may reinterpret events to maintain the belief that victory is still possible. You may ignore clear signs that the situation is unsalvageable. You may even escalate your efforts, hoping that intensity will force a breakthrough. But intensity cannot transform misalignment into harmony. There are battles where winning would not actually bring peace. Even if you achieved the outcome you were chasing, the cost would outweigh the benefit. The energy spent, the relationship strained, the emotional damage accumulated, all of it would remain, making victory feel hollow. This is why surrender is often the true resolution. It allows you to reclaim energy that was being consumed by an unwinnable struggle. It frees attention for experiences that nourish instead of deplete. It restores balance that was lost in the pursuit of proving something to yourself or others. Letting go of the need to win also changes how you relate to future conflicts. You become less reactive, less defensive, more willing to pause before engaging. You ask whether the issue truly matters or whether it is simply triggering the ego's need for validation. This pause prevents unnecessary battles from forming. There is also compassion that emerges when you see how the ego operates. You realize that others are often fighting similar internal wars, driven by their own fears of inadequacy and loss. This understanding softens judgment and opens space for empathy, even when you choose not to participate in the conflict. Another transformation happens internally. Without the constant pressure to prove yourself, you begin to experience a lighter sense of identity. You no longer define yourself by victories or defeats. You exist beyond the scoreboard of success and failure. This freedom allows authenticity to replace performance. The body reflects this change as well. Chronic tension associated with competitiveness and defensiveness eases. Breathing becomes deeper, movements become less hurried. There is a sense of groundedness that was impossible while you were locked in perpetual struggle. Eventually, you see that some battles were never about the external situation at all. They were mirrors reflecting internal wounds, insecurities, and unmet needs. Winning them would not have healed those wounds. Only awareness and compassion could do that. This realization transforms how you interpret past experiences. Instead of seeing them as failures or injustices, you see them as lessons in humility, patience, and discernment. You recognize that life was not trying to defeat you. It was trying to redirect you. Surrender then becomes an act of alignment rather than resignation. It is choosing peace over pride, clarity over stubbornness, growth over repetition. It is acknowledging that strength includes the ability to stop. There is also a profound relief in no longer needing to have the last word, the final explanation, the ultimate vindication. Silence stops feeling like defeat and starts feeling like freedom. You disengage from narratives that required constant defense. In that freedom, new possibilities appear. Relationships that do not revolve around competition. Goals that do not demand self-sacrifice. Experiences that feel collaborative rather than adversarial. Life begins to resemble a path instead of a battlefield. You discover that dignity does not come from winning every fight. It comes from knowing which fights to decline. It comes from the courage to prioritize peace, even when pride protests. Over time, the ego's obsession with victory loses its urgency. You stop needing to prove your worth through struggle. You trust that value exists independent of outcomes. This trust allows you to move through life with less resistance, less tension, less fear of losing. And perhaps the most surprising insight is this: the battles that felt most important often disappear from memory once you step away from them. What remains is not the outcome, but the lesson. The understanding that some struggles were never meant to be resolved through force, only through surrender. In that understanding, you find a deeper form of strength. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to release. Not the strength to endure endlessly, but the strength to recognize when endurance becomes self-harm. This is where peace becomes possible again, not because you defeated something, but because you stopped fighting what was never meant to be won. And in that stillness you realize that surrender did not diminish you. It returned you to yourself. After stepping away from battles that were never meant to be won, another illusion begins to crack. You start to see that not every struggle was driven by pride alone. Some were driven by a belief that persistence itself guarantees meaning, that if you stay long enough, endure enough, push through enough resistance, the path will eventually transform into something right. But there is a quiet truth many people avoid. Staying does not always mean growing. Enduring does not always mean progressing. Sometimes it only means you have not allowed yourself to question whether the path itself was ever meant for you. There is a deep sadness in realizing how much of your life was shaped by the idea that quitting equals failure. That walking away means weakness. That true strength is measured by how long you can endure discomfort without changing direction. This belief keeps people moving forward on roads that slowly drain them, hoping that one more step will finally make everything feel worth it. Persistence is often praised as a virtue, and in many situations it is. But persistence without awareness can become a trap. It convinces you that effort can compensate for misalignment, that if something feels wrong, the solution is not to reconsider, but to try harder. Over time, this creates a strange kind of numbness. You stop asking whether the path fulfills you and start asking only whether you are strong enough to survive it. Fulfillment becomes secondary to endurance. Meaning becomes secondary to consistency. This confusion often begins with good intentions. You commit to something believing it will lead to growth, stability, or happiness. When challenges appear, you push through them because that is what responsible people do. But when the challenges never transform into clarity, when the discomfort never evolves into satisfaction, the mind struggles to accept that persistence might not be the answer. Instead, it doubles down. This doubling down can keep you tied to careers that no longer reflect who you are, to environments that shrink you instead of expanding you, to goals that once inspired you but now feel heavy and distant. You tell yourself that leaving would waste all the time already invested, that starting over would be irresponsible, that others would not understand. But the cost of staying often remains invisible until exhaustion becomes undeniable. Misalignment does not always appear as dramatic distress. It often shows up as a quiet sense of disconnection, work that feels mechanical instead of meaningful, conversations that feel draining instead of energizing, days that blur together without a sense of progress or fulfillment. You may still function, still perform, still meet expectations, but something inside feels muted. The body keeps signaling this misalignment long before the mind admits it. Chronic fatigue, tension that does not fully release, a constant background restlessness that no amount of rest seems to resolve. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that energy is being spent in a direction that does not replenish it. Alignment, in contrast, has a different quality. Even when it requires effort, it does not feel like self-betrayal. Challenges feel purposeful rather than draining. Time feels invested rather than lost. You may still get tired, but the tiredness is clean, not heavy with resentment or doubt. Confusing persistence with alignment prevents you from noticing this difference. Another reason people stay on misaligned paths is fear of uncertainty. Even if the current situation feels wrong, it is known. Leaving introduces variables that cannot be predicted. The mind prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar possibility because familiarity creates a sense of control. There is also social pressure embedded in persistence. Society often celebrates those who stay committed regardless of personal cost. Stories of sacrifice and endurance are admired, while stories of quiet redirection are overlooked. This makes it harder to trust your own instincts when they suggest that a different path might be necessary. The ego can also attach to persistence as proof of strength. Being the one who never gives up becomes part of identity. Letting go then feels like losing that identity, even if holding on to it causes harm. Buddhist reflection offers a different perspective. It suggests that right effort is not about pushing endlessly, but about directing energy where it leads to growth and reducing energy where it leads to suffering. This requires awareness, not just determination. Awareness allows you to ask deeper questions, not only whether you can continue, but whether continuing serves your well-being. Not only whether you are capable of enduring, but whether endurance is necessary at all. There is a moment when persistence shifts from noble to destructive. It happens quietly, when staying no longer comes from purpose, but from fear. Fear of being judged, fear of losing stability, fear of admitting that something important did not turn out as expected. Recognizing this shift requires honesty that can feel uncomfortable. It asks you to separate your past commitment from your present reality, to acknowledge that what once made sense may no longer align with who you have become. Growth changes priorities. Experiences reshape values. What felt meaningful years ago may feel restrictive now. Clinging to outdated commitments prevents you from evolving into the person you are becoming. There is also grief in accepting misalignment. Grief for the time invested, for the hopes attached to the path, for the version of yourself who believed it would lead somewhere different. Allowing this grief is essential because it honors the sincerity of your past choices while freeing you to make new ones. Walking away from misalignment does not erase the value of what you learned along the way. Every experience contributes to clarity, even those that end in redirection. What feels like wasted time often becomes insight that prevents future misalignment. Another shift occurs when you stop measuring success by endurance alone. You begin to value responsiveness, adaptability, and self-awareness. You recognize that strength includes the ability to change course, not just the ability to stay the course. This perspective transforms how you approach future decisions. You listen more closely to your internal signals. You pay attention to whether something energizes or depletes you. You allow curiosity to guide exploration instead of forcing yourself into predetermined roles. There is also relief in releasing the pressure to prove that every decision must be permanent. Life becomes a process of alignment rather than a series of irreversible commitments. This flexibility allows you to move with changing circumstances instead of resisting them. Over time, you begin to experience a different kind of persistence, one rooted in alignment rather than obligation. Effort feels intentional instead of compulsive. Challenges feel meaningful because they contribute to something that resonates deeply with you. The body responds to this alignment with renewed vitality. Energy becomes more stable. Motivation returns without needing constant pressure. Creativity reappears because your mind is no longer preoccupied with surviving a path that does not fit. Relationships also improve because you are no longer carrying hidden frustration. When you live in alignment, you interact from a place of authenticity rather than exhaustion. Communication becomes clearer, boundaries become easier to maintain, and connection becomes more genuine. There is also a growing sense of trust in yourself. Trust that you can recognize when something no longer serves you. Trust that you can navigate uncertainty without collapsing. Trust that your worth is not defined by how long you endure something misaligned. Eventually, you realize that persistence is most powerful when paired with discernment. Without discernment, it becomes stubbornness. With discernment, it becomes dedication to what truly matters. This realization dissolves the fear of starting over. Starting over stops looking like failure and starts looking like alignment in motion. It becomes a conscious choice to invest your energy where it has the potential to return meaning, not just exhaustion. Life begins to feel less like a test of endurance and more like a path of discovery. You move forward not because you must prove something, but because you are drawn towards something that feels alive. And in that movement, you understand that alignment does not eliminate effort, it transforms it. Effort becomes a form of expression rather than compensation. It becomes a way of engaging with life rather than surviving it. This is where true persistence reveals its purpose, not as blind endurance, but as the steady commitment to what nourishes your growth. Not as resistance to change, but as willingness to follow the direction that feels most authentic. In that clarity, the confusion fades. You no longer measure your strength by how much you can endure misalignment. You measure it by your courage to seek alignment, even when it requires letting go of what once defined you. And from that place, life opens in a way that effort alone could never force. Not because you pushed harder, but because you finally stopped pushing in the wrong direction. As alignment begins to replace blind endurance, another subtle pattern comes into focus. You realize that even after seeing the truth, part of you is still resisting it. Not openly, not dramatically, but through quiet negotiation. You tell yourself that maybe things can still be adjusted, reinterpreted, softened into something easier to accept. It is not denial in the obvious sense. It is bargaining, a silent attempt to change reality without admitting that you are trying to change it. There is a kind of suffering that does not come from the situation itself, but from the space between what is and what you wish it were. Negotiating with reality happens in that space. You acknowledge the truth enough to feel its weight, but not enough to release it. So the mind begins searching for compromises that allow you to hold on just a little longer. You tell yourself that if one small detail changed, everything would feel different. If they understood you better, if timing improved, if circumstances shifted, if you tried one more time, then maybe the outcome would finally match the hope you still carry. These thoughts create temporary relief because they postpone the finality of acceptance. But postponement has a cost. Every internal negotiation keeps you emotionally tied to what has already revealed itself. Instead of moving forward, your energy stays invested in a reality that no longer exists in the form you want. It becomes exhausting because you are trying to maintain two conflicting truths at once. What you see and what you wish you could still believe. This is why bargaining prolongs attachment long after clarity appears. You know something is over, misaligned or unsustainable, yet you keep revisiting it mentally, adjusting the story, imagining alternate endings. The mind does this to protect you from the shock of full acceptance, but the protection becomes its own source of pain. Buddhist reflection often speaks about the suffering created by resistance. Negotiation is resistance in disguise. It looks thoughtful, reflective, even hopeful, but underneath it is the refusal to let the present moment be exactly as it is. It is the belief that peace will only come once reality agrees to change. There is also fear embedded in bargaining, fear of what acceptance will demand. Accepting the truth may require you to grieve, to change direction, to rebuild parts of your life you hoped would remain stable. Negotiation delays that process, giving you the illusion that you can keep everything intact just a little longer. In relationships, this often appears as waiting for someone to become who they once seemed to be. You recall earlier moments when connection felt strong and use those memories as evidence that the present distance is temporary. You reinterpret signs, searching for proof that things are improving, even when the overall pattern shows otherwise. This selective attention allows attachment to survive beyond its natural lifespan. In personal goals, negotiation shows up as refusing to acknowledge that a path no longer fulfills you. You may tell yourself that success is just around the corner, that quitting now would erase all the effort invested. So you stay, even as motivation fades, convincing yourself that perseverance will eventually restore meaning. Internally, this creates tension that rarely gets recognized as the true source of exhaustion. It feels like uncertainty, but it is actually the strain of holding conflicting beliefs simultaneously. One part of you wants to release, another part insists on holding on. The body reflects this conflict through restlessness, difficulty focusing, and emotional swings that seem disconnected from external events. It is responding to an internal tug-of-war that has no visible opponent. Another aspect of negotiating with reality is the desire for fairness. You may believe that if you were sincere, patient, and committed, the outcome should reflect that effort. When it does not, bargaining becomes a way to restore a sense of justice. You search for ways the situation could still resolve in a way that validates your investment. But life does not operate on a system of guaranteed returns. Accepting this can feel harsh, yet it also opens the door to freedom. When you stop expecting reality to compensate you for effort, you release the burden of waiting for outcomes that may never arrive. Negotiation also prevents you from experiencing the present fully. Your attention remains split between what is happening now and what you hope might still change. Moments that could bring peace pass unnoticed because your mind is occupied with recalculating possibilities. Over time, this habit can become automatic. Even small disappointments trigger internal bargaining. You immediately begin analyzing what could be done differently, what could still be salvaged, how to reshape events to avoid discomfort. While problem-solving has its place, constant negotiation with unchangeable realities drains emotional energy. There is also a loss of trust in your own perception. When you negotiate too long, you begin doubting what you clearly see. You question whether you are being too sensitive, too impatient, too rigid. This self-doubt keeps you from acting on intuition, leaving you stuck in prolonged indecision. Letting go of negotiation requires a shift from control to acceptance. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means acknowledging what is real without adding resistance. It allows you to redirect energy toward what can still grow instead of what has already ended. This shift often brings immediate relief, not because the situation improves, but because the internal conflict stops. The mind no longer has to maintain competing narratives. Clarity replaces confusion, even if the clarity is painful at first. Grief may follow because acceptance opens the door to emotions that negotiation was suppressing. Sadness, disappointment, anger, these feelings surface once you stop distracting yourself with hypothetical solutions. Allowing them to move through you is part of releasing attachment. As grief settles, space appears, space that was previously filled with mental arguments. In that space, new possibilities become visible, not because they suddenly appeared, but because your attention is no longer anchored to the past. There is also a growing sense of self-respect that comes from honoring reality. You recognize that your peace is not dependent on circumstances aligning perfectly. It comes from your willingness to respond honestly to what is happening. Over time, you become less inclined to negotiate with situations that clearly do not serve you. You trust your perceptions sooner. You allow endings to be endings instead of starting new rounds of bargaining. This does not make you rigid. It makes you responsive. You still consider options where change is possible, but you no longer invest energy in fantasies that contradict what is evident. Peace then becomes simpler. It does not require constant analysis or strategic thinking. It arises naturally when you stop arguing with the present moment. Eventually, you understand that negotiating with reality is like trying to rewrite a story that has already been printed. You can imagine alternate versions, but the pages in front of you remain the same. Freedom comes from turning the page, not from insisting it should read differently. In that freedom, attachment loosens without force. You stop holding on to possibilities that exist only in imagination. You allow life to move forward, even if it moves in a direction you did not choose. And as you move with it, instead of against it, suffering begins to dissolve, not because everything becomes perfect, but because you are no longer prolonging pain by refusing to accept what is already clear. This is where peace becomes steady, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quietly present, like the calm that arrives when the inner argument finally ends. As clarity begins to replace confusion, you would think peace would arrive immediately, but something unexpected happens. Even after seeing the truth, part of you keeps returning to the negotiation table, as if reality were something that could still be persuaded to change its mind. You replay possibilities, search for overlooked options, hold quiet conversations in your head where everything finally turns out differently. It is not that you do not see what is real. It is that you are not ready to stop asking it to be something else. There is a particular ache that comes from bargaining with what has already been decided, a silent tension that lives in the space between acceptance and resistance. Negotiating with reality often begins as hope. You tell yourself that flexibility is wise, that compromise shows maturity, that patience may reveal a different outcome. But beneath this reasoning is a refusal to let the truth stand on its own. You keep adjusting your expectations so that the situation can remain tolerable, even when it no longer brings peace. This internal bargaining can happen for years without being recognized for what it is. You adapt to circumstances that do not nourish you. You reinterpret actions that hurt you. You minimize the distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. Each adjustment feels small, reasonable, necessary. Yet over time, these adjustments accumulate into a life built around avoidance rather than authenticity. The mind does this because full acceptance feels final. Accepting reality often means releasing the version of life you hope for. It means letting go of the imagined future that kept you motivated through uncertainty. Bargaining allows you to keep that imagined future alive a little longer, even if it exists only in thought. There is also a deep discomfort with helplessness. Negotiation creates the illusion of influence, the sense that you are still participating in shaping the outcome. Without it, you are left with the recognition that some aspects of life cannot be controlled, only experienced. This recognition can feel like standing without support, exposed to forces you cannot manage through effort alone. In relationships, this suffering appears as constant reinterpretation. You look for hidden meanings in messages, tone, timing. You try to decode intentions, searching for signs that connection still exists beneath the distance. Instead of acknowledging what is present, you chase what once was, convincing yourself that if you understand deeply enough, you can restore it. This keeps you emotionally invested in a version of the relationship that no longer exists in reality. In personal aspirations, negotiation manifests as refusing to admit that a path has reached its natural end. You revise goals, change metrics, lower expectations, all to preserve the feeling that progress is still possible. While adaptation can be healthy, there is a point where it becomes self-deception, prolonging commitment to something that no longer aligns with who you are becoming. The suffering intensifies because negotiation prevents closure without providing hope. You remain suspended between holding on and letting go, unable to fully commit to either direction. This suspension drains energy in ways that are difficult to articulate because there is no single moment of crisis, only ongoing uncertainty. Buddhist wisdom points to attachment as the root of this pattern. Attachment not only to people or outcomes, but to narratives about how life should unfold. When reality contradicts these narratives, bargaining becomes a way to preserve them. You negotiate not only with circumstances, but with your own expectations. There is also fear of regret woven into this process. The mind worries that acceptance might come too soon, that you might miss an opportunity for reconciliation, redemption, or transformation, so it keeps revisiting possibilities, hoping to avoid the pain of wondering what might have been. Ironically, this attempt to avoid regret often creates deeper regret later because time and energy are spent on situations that could have been released earlier. Another layer of suffering comes from the erosion of self-trust. When you continuously override your intuition to maintain a negotiation, you begin to doubt your ability to perceive reality accurately. You question your feelings, your judgments, your boundaries. This internal confusion makes it harder to act decisively, reinforcing the cycle of hesitation. The body carries this uncertainty as tension that never fully resolves. Restlessness becomes a constant background sensation. Moments of calm are interrupted by sudden waves of doubt. Sleep may bring temporary relief, but waking returns you to the same unresolved internal dialogue. Letting go of negotiation requires acknowledging that clarity does not always feel comforting. It can feel harsh, empty, even disorienting. But within that discomfort lies the possibility of peace, because acceptance frees you from the exhausting task of rewriting reality in your mind. Acceptance is not passive resignation. It is active alignment with what is true. It allows you to redirect your energy toward what can still grow instead of what has already ended. It restores presence by removing the mental filter that distorts every experience through the lens of what you wish were different. There is a quiet strength in this shift. You stop needing answers to move forward. You stop needing certainty to take the next step. You trust that meaning will emerge through action rather than through endless analysis. Grief may still arise because acceptance does not erase emotion. It simply allows emotion to flow without being trapped in cycles of speculation. You feel what is there without adding layers of imagined alternatives. This honesty accelerates healing in ways that negotiation never could. Over time, the urge to bargain weakens. You notice situations more quickly where negotiation would only prolong pain. You learn to pause, breathe, and ask whether the outcome you seek is still grounded in reality or sustained only by attachment. This awareness transforms your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of trying to eliminate it, you learn to coexist with it. You recognize that life's unpredictability does not diminish your capacity for peace. It simply requires flexibility and trust. There is also liberation in realizing that you do not have to understand everything to move on. Some experiences remain ambiguous, not because they lack meaning, but because their meaning is still unfolding. Allowing that unfolding to happen without interference frees you from the burden of constant interpretation. Eventually, you discover that negotiating with reality was never about solving a problem. It was about avoiding the vulnerability of acceptance. Once you face that vulnerability, you find that it does not destroy you. It opens space for resilience that is grounded in truth rather than illusion. This resilience changes how you engage with future challenges. You become less reactive, more observant, more willing to adapt without losing yourself. You recognize when effort is productive and when it becomes resistance disguised as determination. Peace begins to feel accessible again, not because life becomes predictable, but because you are no longer exhausting yourself trying to predict it. You meet each moment as it arrives, responding instead of bargaining, and in that meeting you feel a quiet release. The internal noise fades, the urgency softens, the sense of being trapped dissolves into a recognition that you were never truly stuck, only caught in a loop of trying to negotiate with what had already been decided. This is where suffering loosens its hold, not through dramatic revelation, but through the simple act of stopping the argument with reality. In the silence that follows, you realize that acceptance was not the loss you feared. It was the doorway you had been standing in front of all along, waiting for permission to walk through. When the inner argument with reality finally goes quiet, another kind of pain begins to surface, one that was hidden beneath all the negotiating. It is not about what happened, but about what never did. You start to feel the weight of paths you believed you would walk, moments you thought were waiting ahead, versions of yourself that now exist only in memory and imagination. Some losses do not involve a person leaving or a goal collapsing. Some losses are invisible because they belong to futures that never arrived. There is a particular sadness in realizing that you were not only holding onto a situation, but onto a story about how your life was supposed to unfold. You pictured conversations that would happen, places you would go, stability you would eventually reach, love that would deepen over time, recognition that would come after years of effort. These visions quietly guided your decisions, shaped your patience, gave meaning to your sacrifices. Letting go of the situation also means letting go of the future you built around it. This is why the grief can feel disorienting. You are not just mourning what was real, you are mourning what felt real enough to organize your life around. The mind struggles to process this kind of loss because there is no physical evidence of it. No photographs, no clear timeline, no shared memories. Only a lingering sense that something important was taken away, even though it never fully existed. This grief often arrives later, after the shock has faded. At first, you focus on practical adjustments, changing routines, redefining goals, stabilizing emotions. But once the surface calm returns, the deeper realization emerges. You are no longer moving toward the future you once believed in. That future has quietly dissolved, leaving an open space that feels both freeing and frightening. The mind resists this emptiness because it prefers certainty, even painful certainty, over undefined possibility. You may find yourself revisiting old scenarios, not because you want to return to them, but because they provide a familiar structure. Without them, the future feels undefined, and undefined space can feel like loss rather than opportunity. There is also a sense of betrayal that sometimes accompanies this grief. You trusted that your efforts would lead somewhere meaningful. You believed that patience would be rewarded, that dedication would eventually align with fulfillment. When reality moves in a different direction, it can feel as though life itself changed the agreement without warning. This feeling can create anger that has no clear target. You are not angry at a person or a decision. You are angry at the gap between expectation and reality, at the realization that sincerity does not guarantee outcomes. Buddhist reflection often speaks of impermanence, the understanding that everything is in constant change. But knowing this intellectually is very different from experiencing it emotionally. When impermanence touches your imagined future, it feels personal, even though it is simply the nature of life unfolding. Grieving the life that never happened also involves grieving the version of yourself who was preparing for it. You may feel disconnected from the person you used to be, unsure of who you are without the goals that once defined you. This identity shift can be unsettling because it removes the narrative that provided continuity. At times, you may question your past choices, wondering whether different decisions could have preserved that imagined future. This questioning can become a loop of self-blame, even when circumstances were beyond your control. It is another way the mind tries to restore a sense of order to something that feels chaotic. There is also loneliness in this grief. Because the loss is intangible, it can be difficult to explain to others. People understand the end of relationships, the loss of jobs, the failure of visible plans, but they may not recognize the depth of mourning for possibilities that quietly disappeared. This can lead you to minimize your own feelings, telling yourself that you should not be upset about something that never existed. But the emotional investment was real. The hope was real. The time spent preparing was real. Dismissing that grief only prolongs it. Allowing yourself to feel it without justification becomes an act of compassion toward your own experience. You acknowledge that something meaningful has ended, even if it lived mostly in expectation. Over time, this grief begins to transform. It stops feeling like an open wound and starts feeling like a soft ache, a reminder of how deeply you are capable of caring. You recognize that the imagined future was not wasted energy. It revealed your values, your desires, your capacity for commitment. This recognition helps you rebuild a sense of direction, not by recreating the same future, but by understanding what truly mattered within it. You may realize that what you wanted was not the specific outcome, but the feelings you associated with it: connection, stability, purpose, belonging. These insights become the foundation for new possibilities. Instead of chasing the exact future you lost, you begin to create space for different paths that can offer similar fulfillment in ways you had not considered before. There is also relief hidden within this process. The imagined future carried expectations that you were constantly trying to meet. Letting it go removes the pressure to become a specific version of yourself. You are free to evolve without comparing your present to a script that no longer applies. This freedom can feel unfamiliar at first. Without a predetermined destination, you may feel uncertain about what to pursue. But within that uncertainty lies the opportunity to discover desires that are shaped by who you are now, not by who you thought you needed to be. Gradually, curiosity replaces nostalgia. You start noticing possibilities that were invisible when your focus was fixed on one outcome. Life begins to feel open again, not because the past has been erased, but because it no longer defines the boundaries of your future. There is also gratitude that emerges quietly. Gratitude not for the loss itself, but for the clarity it brought. You see more clearly what you value, what you need, what kind of life feels authentic rather than imposed by expectation. This clarity strengthens your ability to make choices that align with your present self. You become less willing to invest in futures that depend on forcing circumstances or suppressing your intuition. You recognize early signs of misalignment and adjust before attachment grows too strong. Eventually, you realize that grieving the life that never happened is part of learning to live without illusions. It teaches you to appreciate what is real instead of clinging to what might have been. It deepens your presence because you no longer measure the present against an imagined standard. Peace returns not as excitement, but as steadiness. A sense that you can move forward without needing guarantees. That meaning can be created through engagement with what is available, not only through pursuit of what is ideal. And in that steadiness, you understand that letting go of imagined futures is not the end of hope. It is the beginning of a more grounded form of hope, one that does not depend on specific outcomes, but on your ability to adapt, to grow, to find beauty in paths you never planned to walk. The grief softens into acceptance, and acceptance opens into quiet resilience. You are still here. Life is still unfolding. And the space where that imagined future once lived becomes fertile ground for something new, something not forced, not negotiated, not bound to expectation, but allowed to emerge naturally, in its own time, in its own way. After grieving the life that never happened, something subtle begins to change inside you. The tight grip you once held on expectations starts to loosen, not because you forced it to, but because there is nothing left to hold. In that emptiness, a strange sensation appears. It does not feel like victory, and it does not feel like defeat. It feels like quiet. At first, that quiet can be unsettling. When chaos has been your normal state for so long, peace does not feel natural. It feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as if something must be wrong simply because nothing is demanding your attention or draining your energy. You wait for the next disruption, the next emotional storm, the next situation that will pull you back into the intensity you once called life. This is the quiet relief that comes only after surrender. Surrender is often misunderstood as weakness, as giving up, as losing. But in truth, surrender is the moment you stop fighting battles that no longer require your participation. It is the decision to let reality be what it is without trying to reshape it through effort, worry, or control. When you finally stop resisting, your nervous system begins to settle in ways you may not recognize at first. The constant alertness that once felt necessary fades. The tension in your body softens. Thoughts slow down because they no longer have to scan for problems to solve. This shift can feel disorienting because your identity may have been built around managing chaos. If you are used to being the one who fixes everything, who anticipates every outcome, who holds everything together, surrender can feel like stepping away from a role that defined your value. Without that role, you may wonder who you are. You may feel exposed, as if you have lost the armor that protected you from uncertainty. Peace can feel vulnerable because it removes the distractions that once kept deeper emotions at a distance. There is also guilt that sometimes accompanies relief. A quiet question that asks whether you should still be struggling, whether letting go means you did not care enough, whether surrender invalidates the effort you invested. This guilt can pull you back toward old patterns, tempting you to re-engage with problems that are no longer yours to carry. But as you remain in the quiet, something important becomes clear. Relief does not erase love, commitment, or sincerity. It simply releases the suffering that came from trying to control what was never yours to control. You can care deeply without being consumed. You can remember without reliving. You can appreciate without clinging. Chaos often becomes normalized because it creates a sense of purpose. When life is filled with problems, you always know what to focus on. You know where your energy goes, what your role is, how to measure your worth. Peace removes those familiar markers, leaving you with open space that requires a different kind of courage. That courage is the willingness to exist without constant urgency. In this space, you begin to notice small details that chaos once obscured. The way your breath feels when it is not tight. The way time slows down when you are not rushing to prevent something from falling apart. The way simple moments become meaningful when they are not overshadowed by unresolved tension. You may also discover that your body had been holding stress you did not even realize was there. As surrender deepens, waves of fatigue can surface, as if your system is finally allowing itself to rest after a long period of hyperactivity. This is not weakness, it is recovery. Emotions that were suppressed by constant action may also emerge. sadness, relief, gratitude, even unexpected joy. Without chaos to drown them out, these feelings find space to be acknowledged. Allowing them to pass through you without judgment strengthens your ability to remain present. There is also a recalibration of your sense of safety. When chaos was familiar, calm may have felt temporary, something that could disappear at any moment. Over time, as calm persists, your system begins to trust it. You stop scanning for hidden threats. You allow yourself to believe that stability is not an illusion. Relationships shift as well. Without the urgency to fix or control, your interactions become more authentic. You listen without preparing responses. You speak without needing to defend. You allow others to carry their own responsibilities instead of absorbing them into your own emotional landscape. This does not make you distant. It makes you grounded. You are present without being entangled. Surrender also changes how you approach uncertainty. Instead of seeing it as a threat that must be managed, you begin to see it as space for possibility. You recognize that not knowing does not equal danger. It simply means life is still unfolding. This perspective allows you to engage with opportunities more freely. You are no longer constrained by the need to maintain control. You explore without the pressure to guarantee outcomes. You trust that your capacity to adapt is more reliable than your ability to predict. Over time, peace stops feeling unfamiliar. It becomes your baseline instead of chaos. You notice when tension begins to creep back in, and instead of fighting it, you return to surrender. You release the urge to fix everything immediately. You allow situations to evolve without constant interference. There is wisdom in recognizing that not every discomfort requires action. Some require patience, some require distance, some resolve themselves when given time and space. The quiet relief after surrender also deepens your compassion. Having experienced the exhaustion of resistance, you become more understanding of others who are still caught in it. You offer support without trying to rescue. You respect their process while protecting your own stability. Eventually, you realize that surrender did not diminish you. It revealed your resilience. It showed that your strength was never in how much you could endure, but in your ability to release what no longer served your well-being. Peace becomes less about external circumstances and more about internal alignment. Even when challenges arise, you approach them from a place of steadiness rather than panic. You respond instead of react. You adjust without losing your center. Life begins to feel lighter, not because it became easier, but because you are no longer carrying unnecessary weight. You move through experiences with a sense of flow rather than force. You allow endings to be endings and beginnings to unfold naturally. There is also gratitude for the journey that led you here, not gratitude for the pain itself, but for the awareness it created. Without that awareness, you might still be mistaking chaos for vitality, struggle for purpose, control for security. Now you understand that peace does not announce itself with dramatic changes. It arrives quietly, like a gentle shift in atmosphere. You notice it in the absence of tension, in the ease of breathing, in the way your mind no longer races to solve problems that do not exist. And in that quiet, you discover something unexpected. You are not empty without chaos. You are open to experiences that do not require force, to relationships that do not demand constant effort, to a life that grows through alignment rather than pressure. The relief you feel is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of living without resistance. Surrender did not take anything from you that was truly yours. It only returned you to yourself. As peace slowly becomes familiar instead of suspicious, another habit reveals itself beneath the surface. Even after surrender, part of the mind still searches for guarantees. It wants reassurance that the calm will last, that the path ahead will not collapse, that the relief you feel is not temporary. So it begins to look for proof. Proof that you made the right decision. Proof that letting go was justified. Proof that what is meant for you will actually arrive. But life rarely provides this kind of certainty in advance. There is a quiet tension in needing evidence before allowing yourself to trust. You hold back from fully stepping into the present because you are still scanning the horizon for signs that it is safe to relax. This vigilance can feel responsible, even wise, yet it keeps you suspended between surrender and control. The need for proof often comes from past experiences where trust was broken or outcomes were unpredictable. The mind learned that certainty felt safer than openness. So now, even in calm moments, it continues searching for data, signals, confirmation that nothing will disrupt the peace you have just begun to experience. This search for certainty can subtly block life from unfolding naturally. When you chase proof, you are constantly evaluating whether things are progressing according to expectation. You measure conversations, opportunities, emotions, looking for validation that you are moving in the right direction. Instead of participating fully in the experience, part of you remains outside of it, analyzing. This creates distance between you and the present moment. Trust, in contrast, requires participation without guarantees. It asks you to move forward without knowing exactly how things will resolve. This can feel risky because it removes the illusion of control that proof provides. Yet it also allows experiences to develop without being constrained by your need for immediate clarity. In relationships, chasing proof often appears as seeking constant reassurance. You look for signs that connection is secure, that intentions are genuine, that commitment will not disappear unexpectedly. While communication is important, excessive need for reassurance can create pressure that disrupts the natural rhythm of connection. Instead of allowing trust to grow gradually, you try to accelerate it through verification. This urgency can push others away, not because they lack sincerity, but because they feel monitored rather than appreciated. Trust thrives in space, not in constant examination. When you stop testing it, it has room to deepen on its own. In personal growth, the need for proof can prevent you from exploring new directions. You may hesitate to pursue opportunities unless you can predict success. You wait for perfect conditions, clear signs, or external validation before committing energy. This caution can keep you safe from disappointment, but it also keeps you from discovering possibilities that only reveal themselves through action. Natural unfolding requires movement without full visibility. Buddhist reflection emphasizes the concept of impermanence, the understanding that life is a continuous process rather than a fixed outcome. Chasing proof assumes that stability comes from certainty, while practicing trust recognizes that stability comes from adaptability. Adaptability allows you to respond to changes without losing your center. It shifts your focus from controlling the future to engaging with the present. You begin to see uncertainty not as a threat, but as the space where growth occurs. The body responds differently when trust replaces vigilance. Muscles relax because they are no longer preparing for unknown threats. Breathing becomes deeper. Sleep becomes more restorative. These physical changes signal that your system no longer needs to operate in survival mode. Emotionally, trust reduces the intensity of highs and lows. You are less reactive because you are not constantly interpreting events as evidence of success or failure. You experience feelings without assigning them as proof of something larger. There is also freedom in releasing the need to justify your decisions through outcomes. You trust that your choices were made with the awareness you had at the time. Whether they lead to immediate success or unexpected redirection, they contribute to your understanding of yourself and the world. Over time, this perspective transforms your relationship with time itself. You stop rushing for answers. You allow processes to mature at their own pace. You recognize that clarity often arrives after experience, not before it. This patience creates a different kind of confidence, not confidence that everything will go as planned, but confidence that you can handle whatever emerges. You trust your resilience more than your predictions. Trust also reconnects you with intuition. When you are not preoccupied with external proof, you can hear the quieter signals within you, a sense of alignment or discomfort that does not require logical explanation. Acting on these signals strengthens your sense of authenticity. There is also humility in accepting that you do not need to know everything in advance. You allow life to surprise you, to teach you through experience rather than through certainty. This openness brings a sense of wonder that certainty often eliminates. As trust deepens, you become less attached to specific outcomes. You focus on the quality of your actions rather than the results they produce. Effort becomes an expression of who you are, not a strategy to secure guarantees. This shift reduces anxiety because you are no longer measuring your worth by how predictable your life is. You recognize that unpredictability is not failure. It is evidence that you are engaged with a living process rather than a scripted plan. Relationships become more genuine because you are not evaluating them as evidence of safety. You engage with others as they are, not as symbols of reassurance. This authenticity invites deeper connection because it removes the pressure to perform stability. Even challenges feel different when trust replaces the need for proof. Instead of seeing them as signs that something is wrong, you see them as part of the unfolding process. You respond with curiosity instead of panic, with adaptability instead of resistance. There is also relief in not having to control every variable. You conserve energy that was once spent on constant monitoring. This energy becomes available for creativity, presence, and appreciation of simple moments that were previously overshadowed by worry. Eventually, trust becomes less of a practice and more of a state of being. You move through life with a quiet confidence that does not depend on certainty. You make decisions based on alignment rather than fear. You allow experiences to shape you instead of trying to shape them prematurely. Peace deepens because it is no longer fragile. It does not depend on proof that everything will remain stable. It comes from knowing that stability exists within you, not in external conditions. In this state, life feels less like a problem to solve and more like a path to walk. You step forward without needing to see the entire journey. You trust that each step will reveal the next. And in that movement, you realize that certainty was never the source of peace. Trust was. Not blind trust, not naive optimism, but grounded trust in your ability to navigate whatever unfolds. Trust that what is meant to stay will stay without force. Trust that what leaves creates space for something more aligned. When you stop chasing proof, you stop delaying your life. You begin living it. Not as a series of verified outcomes, but as an unfolding experience that does not need to be controlled to be meaningful. And in that unfolding, you find a freedom that certainty could never provide. A quiet assurance that you are supported by something deeper than prediction. The future no longer needs to be proven before you allow yourself to meet it. You meet it with trust. As trust begins to replace the need for constant proof, awareness becomes sharper in a different way. You stop scanning the outside world for signs and start noticing the signals that were always present within you. Not dramatic warnings, not loud alarms, but quiet physical responses that speak long before the mind forms clear thoughts. A heaviness in the chest that appears without explanation. A fatigue that sleep does not fix. A subtle unease that follows you even when nothing seems wrong on the surface. For a long time, you may have ignored these signals or labeled them as weakness, stress, or overthinking. You may have pushed through them because persistence was praised and discomfort was seen as something to conquer. But as you become more aligned with yourself, a new understanding emerges. Your body was never trying to stop you, it was trying to guide you. There is a deep intelligence in the body that does not rely on logic or language. It responds to environments, people, and situations through sensation. When something is not meant for you, the body often knows before the mind is willing to accept it. It tightens, withdraws, resists. Not out of fear, but out of protection. Tension is one of the clearest signals. When you are aligned with what you are doing, effort may be required, but it feels clean. Muscles engage and release naturally. Breathing remains steady. But when you are forcing yourself into something that conflicts with your deeper needs, tension becomes chronic. Shoulders stay raised, jaw clenches, stomach tightens. You carry your body as if preparing for impact, even in safe environments. This tension drains energy because the nervous system remains in a state of alertness. Over time, you may not even notice it because it becomes your baseline. Only when you experience true relaxation do you realize how much strain you are carrying. Exhaustion is another signal that often gets misinterpreted. It is not just physical tiredness from activity. It is a depletion that persists even after rest. You wake up already drained, as if your energy was spent during the night. Tasks that once felt manageable begin to feel overwhelming, not because they changed, but because your system is operating under constant strain. This kind of exhaustion is not laziness. It is the body's way of saying that something in your life is misaligned. Continuing to push through it without reflection only deepens the depletion. Unease can be even more subtle, a background discomfort that has no obvious cause. You may feel restless in situations that appear stable, or uneasy around people who seem kind on the surface. The mind often dismisses this feeling because it lacks concrete evidence, but the body is responding to nuances that logic cannot easily capture. Learning to trust these sensations requires patience because they do not come with explanations. They simply arise, asking to be noticed rather than analyzed. There is also a cultural conditioning that teaches people to override bodily signals. Productivity is prioritized over well-being. Endurance is celebrated more than sensitivity. This conditioning encourages you to treat discomfort as an obstacle to overcome, rather than as information to consider. Over time, ignoring these signals weakens your connection to yourself. You become dependent on external feedback to determine whether something is right or wrong, even though your body has been offering guidance all along. Rebuilding this connection involves slowing down enough to listen, noticing how your body responds in different situations, observing patterns instead of isolated reactions. Recognizing that discomfort is not always something to eliminate, but something to understand. There is also a distinction between discomfort that comes from growth and discomfort that comes from misalignment. Growth-related discomfort often carries a sense of expansion beneath the challenge. It may be intense, but it feels meaningful. Misalignment discomfort feels constrictive, heavy, and draining without providing clarity. Your body differentiates between these two, even when your mind struggles to do so. Relationships often reveal this contrast clearly. With people who align with you, your body relaxes. Conversations flow without effort. Silence feels comfortable instead of awkward. With those who do not align, you may feel tense before interactions even begin, searching for the right words, monitoring your behavior, anticipating conflict or misunderstanding. These reactions are not random. They reflect whether your nervous system feels safe or threatened. In professional or creative pursuits, the body also signals alignment. Work that resonates with you may be demanding, but it energizes you. Time passes quickly because engagement replaces resistance. When you are on a path that is not meant for you, every task feels heavier than it should. Procrastination becomes frequent, not because you lack discipline, but because your system resists investing energy in something that does not nourish it. Listening to these signals does not mean avoiding all difficulty. It means distinguishing between effort that leads to growth and effort that leads to depletion. There is also wisdom in recognizing that the body stores experiences. Past stress, unresolved emotions, and prolonged tension leave imprints that influence how you respond to new situations. When you encounter something similar to a previous experience that caused harm, your body reacts even if your mind believes everything is fine. Understanding this helps you approach your reactions with compassion instead of judgment. You are not overreacting. You are responding to accumulated information stored beyond conscious awareness. Healing involves creating conditions where your body can release what it has been holding. This may include rest, movement, quiet time, supportive environments, or simply permission to feel without needing to fix anything. As release occurs, clarity improves because the noise of suppressed tension diminishes. Trusting bodily signals also strengthens intuition. You begin to notice subtle shifts that guide decisions before they become urgent. You choose environments that support your well-being. You step back from situations that drain you. You move toward experiences that bring calm rather than agitation. There is freedom in no longer needing external validation for these choices. You do not have to justify why something feels wrong or right. You respect your internal guidance even when it cannot be explained logically. Over time, your body becomes less reactive because it trusts that you will listen. Signals become clearer, less intense, because they no longer need to escalate to get your attention. This creates a feedback loop of trust between your mind and body. Peace deepens as a result. You are no longer fighting yourself. Decisions feel grounded instead of forced. You navigate life with a sense of alignment that reduces unnecessary struggle. There is also a newfound respect for your limits. You recognize that capacity fluctuates and that honoring those fluctuations prevents burnout. You pace yourself not out of fear, but out of understanding that sustainability is more valuable than constant intensity. This perspective changes how you define strength. Strength is no longer measured by how much discomfort you can tolerate, but by how accurately you can respond to what your body is communicating. You become less likely to stay in situations that require you to suppress your instincts. You prioritize environments that allow you to feel at ease. You seek relationships where you do not have to defend your boundaries constantly. Life becomes quieter in a nourishing way. Not empty, not dull, but balanced. You experience engagement without overload, connection without depletion, purpose without pressure. And in that balance, you realize that your body was never an obstacle to overcome. It was a compass, pointing you toward what supports your growth and away from what diminishes it, offering guidance that does not depend on external approval, helping you navigate complexity through sensation rather than constant analysis. When you honor that guidance, you move through life with greater ease. You trust your responses. You adapt without losing yourself. You allow paths to open and close without forcing them. This is where wisdom becomes embodied rather than theoretical, not something you think about, but something you feel and live through daily choices. Your body becomes an ally instead of a burden, and as you listen more closely, you discover that alignment does not shout, it whispers. Through tension that asks for release, through exhaustion that asks for rest, through unease that asks for attention. Signals that were never meant to limit you, only to lead you back to what is truly yours. As you begin to trust the quiet intelligence of your body, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You notice that the moments of greatest tension were not only about misalignment, but about resistance. A refusal to loosen your grip, even when holding on was clearly exhausting you. There is a strange comfort in holding on, even when it hurts. not because the situation feels good, but because letting go would drop you into the unknown. And the unknown feels more threatening than familiar discomfort. So you tighten your grip, convincing yourself that persistence is strength, that control is safety, that if you just try harder, the outcome will bend in your favor. This is where holding on becomes less about love, commitment, or responsibility, and more about fear. Control is often mistaken for stability. You believe that as long as you are managing every detail, anticipating every possibility, preventing every unwanted outcome, you can avoid chaos. But control does not remove uncertainty. It only delays your confrontation with it. The urge to force outcomes grows strongest when life feels unpredictable. When something important is at stake, the mind tries to reduce risk by clinging to whatever seems solid. You replay conversations, analyze decisions, plan multiple scenarios, hoping that preparation will eliminate surprise. But life does not negotiate with preparation. No amount of mental rehearsal can guarantee how events will unfold. Yet the illusion of control can be addictive because it gives you something to do with your anxiety. Action feels safer than stillness, even when the action has no real effect on the outcome. Holding on also creates the feeling that you are not helpless. It preserves the identity of being capable, proactive, responsible. Letting go can feel like admitting defeat, as if releasing control means you failed to manage the situation properly. This belief keeps people tied to circumstances long after they stop being healthy. Relationships that require constant effort to sustain. Goals that demand sacrifices that no longer feel meaningful. Roles that drain energy without offering growth. Underneath all of it is the fear that if you stop controlling, everything will collapse. There is also a deeper layer of fear of emptiness. If you release what you have been holding, what remains? The mind struggles to answer this question, so it avoids it altogether. It fills space with activity, planning, worry, anything that prevents you from facing the possibility that you may need to rebuild your life in a new way. Control becomes a shield against uncertainty. Buddhist reflection suggests that suffering often arises not from change itself, but from resistance to change. Holding on is resistance in its most persistent form. It tries to freeze reality in a shape that feels manageable, even though reality is constantly moving. When you hold on tightly, you also limit your ability to respond to new opportunities. Your hands are full, leaving no room to receive what might be more aligned with who you are becoming. You remain focused on preserving what exists instead of exploring what could emerge. This is why control can quietly block growth. There is also exhaustion that comes from constant management. Monitoring every detail, anticipating every risk, maintaining the appearance of stability requires energy that could be used for creativity, connection, and presence. Over time, life starts to feel like a project instead of an experience. The body reflects this strain through chronic tension, difficulty relaxing, and a persistent sense of urgency, even in calm situations. You may feel restless when there is nothing to fix, because stillness removes the distraction that control provides. Learning to release control does not mean becoming passive. It means recognizing what is actually within your influence and what is not. It means focusing on your responses rather than on manipulating outcomes. There is a difference between participating in life and trying to dominate it. Participation involves engagement without attachment to results. You act with intention, but you remain open to whatever unfolds. Control seeks to guarantee results, closing off possibilities that do not match your expectations. Letting go of control requires trust, not in specific outcomes, but in your ability to adapt. It acknowledges that uncertainty is unavoidable, but also survivable. You begin to see uncertainty not as a void, but as a field of potential. There is also humility in accepting that you do not have to orchestrate everything. Life has its own momentum, its own intelligence. When you stop interfering excessively, you notice patterns and opportunities that were invisible while you were focused on managing. Relationships benefit from this shift as well. When you stop trying to control how others feel, respond, or change, interactions become more authentic. You allow people to show you who they are instead of who you hope they will become. This clarity may lead to deeper connection or necessary distance, but it always leads to truth. In personal goals, releasing control allows creativity to replace rigidity. You explore paths without demanding that they lead to a predetermined destination. You experiment, adjust, and learn, trusting that meaningful direction will emerge through experience rather than through strict planning. There is also relief in not having to carry responsibility for everything. You realize that some outcomes are influenced by factors beyond your awareness or power. Accepting this reduces the pressure to perform perfectly, opening space for self-compassion. As control loosens, you may feel vulnerable at first. Without the constant effort to manage, you face uncertainty directly. But within that vulnerability is resilience. You discover that you can navigate unpredictability without collapsing. This discovery builds a deeper form of confidence in your capacity to respond rather than in your ability to prevent. You become flexible instead of rigid, attentive instead of anxious. Over time, you notice that life feels lighter. Decisions become simpler because they are guided by alignment rather than fear. You stop trying to force situations into shapes that no longer fit. You allow endings to happen without turning them into personal failures. There is also a growing appreciation for the present moment. Without the distraction of constant planning and worry, you experience life as it is happening. Ordinary moments gain richness because your attention is no longer divided. Peace becomes sustainable because it does not depend on maintaining control. It arises from acceptance of uncertainty as part of existence. You trust that stability comes from within, not from perfect circumstances. Eventually, holding on loses its appeal. You see it for what it was, an attempt to protect yourself from fear. And you recognize that protection built on resistance only prolongs discomfort. Letting go becomes an act of courage, not because it guarantees a better outcome, but because it allows life to move freely again. You stop blocking the flow with expectations and demands. You step aside and let experiences unfold. In that openness, you discover possibilities that control would never have allowed, paths that feel natural instead of forced, connections that develop without pressure, opportunities that arrive unexpectedly because you created space for them. You realize that uncertainty was never the enemy. It was the doorway, a doorway to a life that does not require constant defense, a life that grows through trust rather than force. And as you walk through it, you feel something you may not have felt in a long time. Freedom. Not the freedom of having everything figured out, but the freedom of not needing to. The freedom of allowing life to be dynamic, unpredictable, alive. The freedom of knowing that you can meet whatever comes without tightening your grip again. Holding on was never the source of safety. It was the barrier to peace. When the grip of control finally loosens, something unexpected happens. You begin to see that many of the outcomes you fought hardest to secure were not the ones that would have brought you peace. What once felt like loss starts to reveal itself as redirection. Doors that closed without explanation now look less like rejection and more like protection. Yet disappointment still lingers, heavy and quiet, because unmet expectations leave an empty space where certainty used to live. Disappointment has a way of slowing time. The moment you realize that something you hoped for will not happen, the future you were leaning toward collapses, and you are left standing in the present without a clear path forward. It can feel like failure even when you did everything you could. It can feel personal even when circumstances were beyond your influence. There is a sharp sting in recognizing that effort does not always translate into outcomes. But beneath that sting, there is also freedom that is easy to miss. Expectations act like invisible walls. They define what success looks like, what happiness should feel like, what direction life must take to be considered meaningful. When those expectations break, the walls break with them. At first, this feels like chaos. Without the structure of expectation, you may feel lost, unsure of what to pursue or who you are becoming. Yet that same loss of structure creates space for possibilities that did not fit inside the original plan. Space for experiences that were previously dismissed because they did not align with what you thought you wanted. Space for a version of life that reflects who you are now, rather than who you believed you needed to be. Disappointment often reveals attachments you did not realize you had. You may have been attached not only to a goal, but to the identity that came with achieving it. To the story you would tell about yourself, to the recognition you hoped to receive, to the sense of completion you believed it would bring. When that outcome disappears, you are invited to redefine yourself without relying on external validation. This process can feel disorienting because it removes familiar markers of progress. You can no longer measure your worth by proximity to a specific outcome. Instead, you must explore what genuinely fulfills you, independent of expectation. There is also a quiet relief in no longer having to maintain a path that no longer felt authentic. Even if the disappointment is painful, it may also release you from pressure that you had normalized. You may notice that your body relaxes in ways you did not expect, that your mind feels less crowded, that your energy begins to return. This relief is not betrayal of your past hopes. It is evidence that something within you recognized the misalignment before your mind did. Disappointment also refines your understanding of what truly matters. When superficial desires fall away, deeper values become clearer. You may realize that what you wanted was not the specific outcome, but the feelings associated with it: belonging, purpose, stability, connection. With this awareness, you can pursue those feelings through different paths that align more closely with your current self. There is also humility in accepting that you do not always know what is best for you. Life's redirections often reveal opportunities that could not have been planned. Encounters that shift your perspective, experiences that expand your capacity for empathy, challenges that strengthen resilience in ways success never could. Over time, you begin to trust that disappointment is not the end of the story. It is a turning point, a recalibration that guides you towards something more fitting. You stop interpreting setbacks as proof of inadequacy and start seeing them as information. Information about where your energy is better invested. Relationships can also transform through disappointment. You learn to appreciate those who remain present without conditions. You release connections that depended on roles you no longer play. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of respect for your own well-being. Creativity often flourishes in this space as well. Without the pressure to meet specific expectations, you explore ideas more freely. You experiment without fear of failure, because you have already experienced disappointment and survived it. This freedom allows authentic expression to emerge. There is also a deepening of compassion. Having faced unmet expectations, you become more understanding of others navigating similar experiences. You offer support without trying to fix them, knowing that each person must find their own meaning within disappointment. Your relationship with time changes too. Instead of rushing toward outcomes, you become attentive to the present. You notice small shifts, subtle opportunities, quiet joys that were previously overshadowed by the urgency to achieve. Life begins to feel less like a race and more like a journey of discovery. Eventually, you recognize that disappointment did not strip you of possibility. It stripped you of illusion. It removed the narrative that limited your vision and replaced it with openness. This openness allows you to build a future that is not constrained by past expectations. You create goals that reflect growth rather than obligation. You pursue experiences that resonate rather than impress. There is also a sense of liberation in not needing everything to work out perfectly. You accept that unpredictability is part of living fully. You become resilient not because you avoid disappointment, but because you know it does not define you. Peace returns in a quieter form, not as excitement about a specific outcome, but as confidence in your ability to navigate whatever arises. You trust that meaning will continue to emerge even when plans change. And in that trust, disappointment transforms from an obstacle into a guide. It points you away from what does not fit and toward what does, even if the direction is unclear at first. It invites you to release attachments that limit your growth. It encourages you to explore without needing guarantees. You realize that some of the most meaningful parts of your life began as unexpected detours, paths you would never have chosen deliberately but now cannot imagine living without. Disappointment becomes less frightening because you see its hidden generosity. It makes room for authenticity. It challenges you to define success on your own terms. It teaches you that fulfillment is not found in achieving every desire, but in aligning with what genuinely supports your well-being. Freedom emerges not from having everything you wanted, but from discovering that you do not need everything you once believed you did. And as you move forward with this awareness, life feels less constrained by expectation and more guided by intuition. You follow what feels alive instead of what looks impressive. You measure progress by inner peace rather than external milestones. The future becomes something you meet with curiosity instead of pressure. Disappointment did not close your path. It opened a different one, a path that was hidden behind the illusion of certainty, waiting for you to release what no longer served you so you could finally step into what does. As disappointment softens into clarity, another realization quietly rises to the surface. You begin to notice that some things did not fall apart because you failed to hold them together. They faded because they no longer belonged to the person you were becoming. What once felt necessary for your happiness now feels distant, almost unfamiliar, as if it belonged to a different lifetime. This recognition can be both freeing and unsettling. There is a quiet ache in admitting that something you once depended on no longer fits. Not because it was wrong, not because it lacked value, but because you have changed in ways you did not anticipate. Growth rarely announces itself with certainty. It often appears as a subtle discomfort with what used to feel normal. Outgrowing something can feel like betrayal. You may question whether you are abandoning your past self, whether you are being ungrateful for what once supported you. The mind searches for explanations, trying to make sense of the shift, but evolution does not always provide clear reasons. Sometimes it simply happens. Relationships are often the first place this change becomes visible. People who once understood you effortlessly may now feel out of sync. Conversations that used to energize you may now leave you drained. Shared goals that once bonded you may no longer hold the same meaning. This does not mean the connection was false. It means it fulfilled its purpose during a particular phase of your life. Letting go of these connections can be painful because they carry memories of who you used to be. Releasing them feels like releasing a part of your identity, yet holding on out of obligation prevents both you and the other person from growing in directions that reflect your current truths. There is also grief in recognizing that some bonds cannot evolve alongside you. You may wish for mutual growth, for alignment to return, for familiarity to feel comfortable again. But growth is not always synchronized. People change at different rhythms, shaped by experiences that are uniquely their own. Accepting this requires compassion, both for yourself and for others. Dreams can also be outgrown. Goals that once fueled your motivation may lose their intensity. You may find yourself questioning ambitions that used to define your sense of purpose. This shift can feel frightening because it removes the structure that guided your efforts. Without those goals, you may feel directionless for a time, but this pause is not emptiness, it is recalibration. Your values are reorganizing themselves around who you are now, rather than who you were when those dreams first formed. New desires will emerge, shaped by deeper understanding rather than external expectations. There is wisdom in allowing this transition instead of forcing yourself to maintain outdated aspirations. Continuing to pursue something that no longer resonates only creates inner conflict. You expend energy trying to convince yourself that it still matters, while your intuition quietly pulls you elsewhere. Outgrowing environments follows a similar pattern. Places that once felt safe may begin to feel restrictive. Routines that once provided comfort may start to feel monotonous. You may crave change without knowing exactly what form it should take. This restlessness is not ingratitude. It is a signal that your capacity has expanded. Staying in environments that no longer support your growth can lead to stagnation disguised as stability. You may maintain appearances of success while feeling disconnected from your own life. Recognizing this disconnect is the first step toward realignment. There is also courage required to leave familiar spaces without guarantees of what comes next. The unknown can feel overwhelming, especially when the current situation is functional on the surface. But evolution rarely happens within comfort zones that have already served their purpose. Your identity shifts through these experiences. You begin to define yourself less by roles and more by values. Instead of asking what you should achieve, you ask what feels meaningful. Instead of trying to fit into predetermined categories, you allow yourself to exist fluidly, adapting as you learn. This flexibility reduces fear of loss because you trust your ability to rebuild. You know that what you release creates space for something more aligned. You stop interpreting endings as failures and start seeing them as transitions. There is also a deepening of self-respect in honoring your growth. You stop minimizing your needs to preserve familiarity. You stop apologizing for changing. You accept that evolution is not something to justify, but something to embody. Over time, you develop sensitivity to early signs of misalignment. You notice when something begins to feel forced instead of natural. You adjust before resentment accumulates. This responsiveness prevents prolonged suffering and allows smoother transitions. Outgrowing also brings gratitude. You appreciate what each phase of your life contributed, even if it no longer belongs to your present. You recognize that without those experiences, you would not have developed the awareness that now guides you. Gratitude softens the pain of letting go. It transforms loss into appreciation, allowing you to carry the essence of what mattered without clinging to its physical form. Your relationship with time changes as well. You stop measuring progress by permanence. Instead of expecting things to last indefinitely, you value their impact while they are present. You understand that impermanence does not diminish significance. There is also freedom in no longer needing everything to remain the same. Change becomes less threatening because you trust your ability to adapt. You engage with life dynamically, responding to shifts rather than resisting them. Peace emerges from this acceptance. You no longer feel compelled to preserve versions of yourself that have expired. You allow your identity to evolve naturally, guided by curiosity rather than fear. Relationships that align with your growth feel lighter. Interactions become mutual rather than obligatory. You attract people who resonate with your current perspective, creating connections that support rather than constrain you. Purpose becomes fluid rather than fixed. You pursue interests that reflect your evolving self, knowing that they may change again in the future. This openness keeps your life vibrant, preventing stagnation. There is also a quiet confidence that comes from surviving transitions. You know that even if you lose what feels essential today, you will find new sources of meaning. This confidence reduces attachment because you trust your resilience more than your circumstances. Eventually, you realize that outgrowing something is not a sign that it was wrong for you. It was right for the time it existed. Its purpose was to shape you, to prepare you for what comes next. Loss then becomes part of growth rather than evidence of failure. You begin to see your life as a series of chapters, each necessary, each complete in its own way. Some chapters end quietly without dramatic closure. Others end abruptly, forcing you to adapt quickly. But all contribute to the narrative of who you are becoming. Acceptance replaces resistance. You stop asking why things changed and start asking what this change makes possible. Curiosity replaces regret. You explore new directions with openness instead of hesitation. There is also tenderness toward your past self. You recognize that you did the best you could with the awareness you had. You honor the effort, the sincerity, the courage it took to engage fully with what once mattered. And as you move forward, you carry that tenderness with you. It becomes a source of compassion for yourself and for others navigating their own transitions. Life feels less like something slipping away and more like something continuously unfolding. You are not losing parts of yourself, you are revealing new ones. Outgrowing what once felt essential is not abandonment, it is evolution. A quiet transformation that reshapes your path without asking for permission, guiding you toward experiences that reflect the depth of who you have become. And in that transformation, you find not emptiness, but expansion, a sense that life is not narrowing, but opening in directions you could not see before. What you release does not disappear. It becomes the foundation for what you are ready to receive next. As you begin to accept that growth sometimes requires releasing what once felt essential, another realization surfaces with quiet intensity. You start to see that some of the things you fought hardest to keep were not held together by love, but by effort. You believed that if you just tried harder, gave more, endured longer, the connection would finally become secure. There is a deep sadness in recognizing how much energy was spent trying to earn something that should never have required proof. Many people learn early in life that love must be maintained through performance. Approval becomes conditional, affection becomes tied to behavior, attention becomes something to win rather than something freely given. Over time, this creates a pattern where struggle feels like evidence of commitment. If it is difficult, it must be meaningful. If it hurts, it must be real. This belief follows you into adulthood without announcing itself. You find yourself working tirelessly to keep relationships alive, measuring your worth by how much you can tolerate. You apologize for things you did not do, compromise beyond your limits, ignore discomfort to avoid conflict. Each sacrifice feels like an investment in the bond, proof that you care enough to endure. But connection built on endurance slowly loses its authenticity. When love becomes something to earn, you stop showing up as your true self. You become the version of yourself that you think will be accepted. This creates distance even while you are physically present. The relationship continues, but the real you fades into the background, replaced by a carefully managed persona. Forcing connection often begins with fear of loss. You worry that if you stop trying, the bond will disappear. So you push harder, initiate conversations, smooth over disagreements, take responsibility for emotional balance even when it is not yours to carry. This constant effort can feel like dedication, but it also creates imbalance. One person becomes responsible for maintaining the entire connection, while the other grows accustomed to receiving without reciprocating. Over time, resentment may surface, but it often gets suppressed because acknowledging it would threaten the relationship. You tell yourself that love requires sacrifice, that patience will eventually be rewarded, that understanding will bridge the gap. Yet the more you force closeness, the more fragile it becomes. True connection thrives on mutual presence, not on pressure. When one person is constantly trying to secure the bond, the dynamic shifts from partnership to pursuit. The relationship becomes something to chase rather than something to share. This pursuit creates anxiety because it never feels complete. You are always evaluating whether you have done enough, said the right thing, anticipated needs correctly. Instead of enjoying the connection, you are managing it. Buddhist reflection suggests that attachment can distort love into grasping. Instead of appreciating the other person as they are, you cling to the idea of what the relationship should be. This grasping generates tension that both people feel, even if they cannot articulate it. There is also a loss of spontaneity. Interactions become calculated, driven by the goal of preserving the bond rather than by genuine expression. You hesitate to speak honestly for fear of creating distance. You prioritize harmony over authenticity, believing that conflict will destroy what you have. But suppressed truth eventually surfaces in indirect ways, through emotional withdrawal, passive frustration, or exhaustion that cannot be explained. Forcing connection also erodes self-trust. You begin to doubt your perceptions, convincing yourself that discomfort is normal, that your needs are excessive, that asking for reciprocity is unreasonable. This internal conflict weakens your sense of identity, making it harder to recognize when the relationship is no longer healthy. There is also a paradox in trying to earn love through struggle. The more you give without receiving, the less valued your efforts may become. What once required appreciation becomes expected. Your sacrifices fade into the background, leaving you feeling invisible despite your constant presence. Letting go of this pattern requires redefining what love means. Love is not proven by how much pain you can endure. It is reflected in how safe you feel being yourself. It grows through mutual care, not through one-sided persistence. Releasing the need to earn love can feel terrifying because it removes the strategies you relied on for security. Without those strategies, you face the possibility that some connections may not survive. But those that do survive become stronger because they are based on authenticity rather than obligation. There is also liberation in allowing relationships to evolve naturally. You stop forcing conversations, explanations, or closeness. You give space for both people to show up willingly. This space reveals whether the connection has genuine depth or was sustained primarily by effort. When love is mutual, it does not require constant maintenance. It adjusts, forgives, reconnects without needing to be chased. It allows both people to grow individually while remaining connected. Your relationship with yourself changes as well. You begin to treat your own needs with respect instead of viewing them as obstacles to harmony. You set boundaries not to create distance, but to preserve well-being. You understand that saying no to what diminishes you is a way of saying yes to what supports you. This self-respect becomes a foundation for healthier connections. You attract people who appreciate your authenticity rather than your compliance. Interactions feel lighter because they are not driven by fear of loss. There is also healing in recognizing that love should not feel like constant work. Effort may be required at times, especially during challenges, but the overall experience should include ease, joy, and mutual support. When struggle dominates, it is a signal that something is misaligned. Over time, you become more sensitive to the difference between effort that nurtures connection and effort that compensates for its absence. You invest in relationships that reciprocate naturally and release those that rely on your endurance alone. Compassion emerges for your past self who believed that struggle was necessary. You understand that you were trying to protect yourself from abandonment using the tools you had at the time. This compassion allows you to move forward without bitterness. Peace replaces urgency. You no longer feel compelled to secure every bond. You trust that what is meant to stay will stay without constant reinforcement. This trust creates space for deeper intimacy because it removes the pressure to perform. Love becomes something you experience rather than something you chase. It flows through shared presence, honest communication, and mutual respect. It does not demand that you diminish yourself to preserve it, and in that realization, the illusion dissolves. You see clearly that forcing connection does not strengthen love, it weakens it, because love cannot grow where authenticity is suppressed and effort replaces sincerity. It requires openness, vulnerability, and freedom to exist without manipulation. As you step away from the need to earn love through struggle, you discover a quieter form of connection, one that feels natural instead of exhausting, secure instead of fragile, supportive instead of demanding. You realize that the most meaningful bonds are not built through endurance, they are built through presence. And presence cannot be forced. It can only be offered and received freely, without conditions, without fear, without the belief that you must prove your worth to deserve it. When you stop forcing connection and release the need to earn love through struggle, a quiet emptiness often follows. The effort that once filled your days disappears, and with it goes the sense of urgency that made you feel occupied. What remains is a space that feels unfamiliar, almost weightless, as if something essential is missing, even though you chose to let it go. There is a strange discomfort in having nothing to fix, nothing to chase, nothing demanding your attention. This is the space where many people rush to fill the silence. They reach for distractions, new goals, new relationships, new commitments, anything that prevents them from feeling the absence of what used to be there. Replacement feels safer than stillness because it restores movement and purpose quickly. But sometimes growth asks you to sit in the pause. Letting go without replacing is one of the most challenging experiences because it removes all the structures that once defined your direction. You are no longer attached to what you released, yet you have not discovered what will take its place. The future feels open but undefined, and the mind struggles with that uncertainty. In this in-between space, identity can feel fragile. You may wonder who you are without the roles, routines, or connections that shaped your daily life. Without those reference points, you are invited to encounter yourself directly, without filters or distractions. This encounter can be unsettling because it exposes emotions that were hidden by constant activity. Sadness may surface, not as sharp pain, but as a quiet heaviness. Restlessness may appear, urging you to move even when there is nowhere specific to go. Doubt may whisper that you made a mistake, that you should return to what was familiar simply to escape the uncertainty. Yet within this discomfort lies transformation. The absence of immediate replacement allows deeper healing to occur. When you do not rush to fill the void, you give yourself time to process what has ended. You allow memories to settle into understanding rather than being pushed aside by new distractions. You create space for insight to emerge naturally. There is also a recalibration of your nervous system. After long periods of intensity, the body needs time to adjust to calm. The silence may feel loud at first because you are not used to operating without pressure. Over time, this calm becomes grounding rather than unsettling. In this space, you begin to notice subtle changes in perception. Without constant stimulation, your awareness expands. You observe thoughts without immediately reacting to them. You experience emotions without needing to resolve them instantly. You learn that presence does not require action. This learning builds patience, a quality that cannot develop in environments of constant urgency. Patience allows you to trust that clarity will arrive in its own time. It shifts your relationship with uncertainty from fear to curiosity. There is also freedom in not needing to define your next step immediately. You allow possibilities to remain open instead of narrowing them prematurely. This openness increases the likelihood that what emerges will align with your authentic needs rather than with external expectations. Relationships can feel different during this period as well. You may withdraw from social obligations that no longer feel genuine, not out of avoidance, but out of a desire for authenticity. This withdrawal creates space for connections that resonate more deeply when they eventually appear. Creativity often awakens in the absence of pressure. Without a specific goal to achieve, you explore ideas for their own sake. You engage in activities that bring quiet satisfaction rather than external validation. This exploration reconnects you with intrinsic motivation, the desire to create and experience without needing approval. There is also an opportunity to redefine your relationship with time. Instead of viewing it as something to fill productively, you experience it as something to inhabit fully. Moments stretch, details become more vivid, and life feels less rushed. This shift can reveal aspects of yourself that were overshadowed by busyness, interests you had forgotten, values that were buried under obligations, sensitivities that were numbed by constant activity. You begin to rediscover who you are when you are not performing for anyone else. There is vulnerability in this rediscovery because it removes the protective layer of distraction. You face your fears directly: fear of loneliness, fear of insignificance, fear of uncertainty. But facing them reduces their power, transforming them from overwhelming threats into manageable emotions. Self-compassion becomes essential during this time. You learn to treat yourself with kindness instead of judgment, recognizing that transition is inherently disorienting. You allow yourself to move slowly, to rest without guilt, to exist without needing justification. Over time, the emptiness begins to feel spacious rather than hollow. You recognize it as potential rather than absence. It becomes a field where new experiences can take root organically, without being forced into place. Opportunities may appear unexpectedly, not because you searched for them aggressively, but because you created room for them. Conversations lead to new ideas. Encounters spark curiosity. Environments reveal possibilities that were previously hidden by preoccupation. When something new finally emerges, it feels different from previous pursuits. It does not come with the pressure to prove anything. It feels aligned, natural, as if it grew from the quiet rather than from effort. You engage with it gently, aware that it does not need to replace what was lost. It can exist on its own terms without being compared to the past. This awareness prevents you from repeating old patterns of attachment. You appreciate the new without clinging to it. You remain open to change, knowing that stability comes from within rather than from circumstances. Peace deepens as you realize that you can exist comfortably without constant direction. You trust your ability to navigate transitions without rushing to define them. You accept that some periods of life are meant for reflection rather than action. There is also gratitude for the stillness that once felt uncomfortable. It allowed you to heal, to grow, to reconnect with yourself in ways that would not have been possible if you had filled the void immediately. Letting go without replacing becomes an act of faith. Faith in the unfolding of life, in your resilience, in the belief that meaning does not disappear when one chapter ends. It simply waits for the right conditions to reappear in a new form. Eventually, you understand that this in-between space was never empty. It was sacred, a place where you could shed expectations, release attachments, and rediscover your essence without interference. A place where you learned that you are not defined by what you hold, but by your capacity to remain present when there is nothing to hold. And as you step out of that space into whatever comes next, you carry a quiet strength that did not exist before. The strength of knowing that you can let go, wait and trust without rushing to fill the silence. The strength of knowing that life does not need to be forced to continue. It continues on its own, gently, patiently, unfolding in ways that only become visible when you stop trying to control the timing. After learning to sit in the empty space without rushing to replace what was lost, a new awareness begins to form. You start to notice that not everything ends because it breaks. Some things simply reach their natural conclusion quietly, without drama, without a clear moment of collapse. And yet, the absence of catastrophe can make the ending harder to accept. There is a subtle confusion when nothing is visibly wrong, but something no longer feels alive. A quiet discomfort appears when you realize that you have been trying to repair something that is not damaged. Conversations repeat themselves without deepening. Efforts continue without bringing renewal. You keep adjusting, improving, and refining, hoping to revive the energy that once existed, even though it has already completed its course. This is where courage becomes necessary. Stopping the urge to fix requires admitting that the role you played has reached its end. It asks you to release the belief that effort can extend everything indefinitely. It challenges the idea that endings must be dramatic to be valid. Completion often arrives softly. A project that once inspired you begins to feel mechanical. A relationship that once felt expansive becomes routine. A path that once felt meaningful starts to feel like repetition instead of growth. Nothing is broken, yet nothing is evolving either. The mind struggles with this kind of ending because it prefers clear explanations. If something failed, it is easier to let go. Failure provides closure, but when something simply finishes, there is no obvious reason to point to, no story to justify the departure. This uncertainty can lead to prolonged attachment. You may keep investing energy, hoping that one more effort will reignite what has faded. You convince yourself that consistency will restore passion, that persistence will reverse the quiet shift that has already occurred. But forcing continuation often drains what little vitality remains. Recognizing completion requires listening to subtle signals. The absence of excitement, the lack of curiosity, the sense that you are repeating rather than discovering. These signs do not shout, they whisper. Ignoring them leads to stagnation disguised as loyalty. There is also fear in acknowledging that something is finished because it opens a space of uncertainty again. You may worry about what comes next, about losing stability, about stepping into the unknown without a clear direction. Yet completion is not loss. It is transition. Every phase of life prepares you for another, even if you cannot see the connection immediately. Holding on to a completed phase prevents the next one from emerging. It is like refusing to leave a room after the conversation has ended, hoping it will begin again. Relationships often illustrate this challenge. Two people may continue interacting out of habit rather than connection. There is no conflict, no betrayal, just a quiet sense that the bond has served its purpose. Continuing out of obligation can create a subtle sadness, a feeling that both are staying out of comfort rather than choice. Letting go in such situations requires honesty without blame. You acknowledge the value of what was shared while accepting that it no longer reflects who you are becoming. This kind of release preserves dignity and gratitude instead of resentment. Work and ambitions follow similar patterns. You may achieve goals that once defined your identity, only to discover that they no longer fulfill you. The achievement itself becomes the completion. Continuing to pursue the same direction out of habit can prevent you from discovering new interests. There is also a shift in values as you grow. What once felt essential may now feel secondary. Priorities rearrange themselves, sometimes without conscious decision. Accepting this shift allows your life to align with your current understanding rather than with outdated expectations. Completion teaches humility. It reminds you that nothing is meant to remain unchanged forever. It encourages flexibility, the willingness to adapt rather than cling. There is also peace in recognizing that you do not need dramatic events to justify change. You can leave simply because it is time. You can stop simply because the energy has moved on. You can rest without waiting for exhaustion to force you. This perspective reduces fear of endings. You begin to trust that closure can be gentle, that transitions do not always require suffering. You allow yourself to step away before burnout, before conflict, before deterioration. Gratitude becomes central in this process. Instead of focusing on what is ending, you focus on what it gave you. You carry the lessons forward without needing to preserve the form in which they were learned. There is also liberation in no longer measuring success by permanence. You value experiences for their impact rather than their duration. Something can be meaningful even if it does not last indefinitely. Your relationship with effort changes as well. You invest where growth is possible and release where it has plateaued. This selective engagement preserves energy for pursuits that continue to evolve. Completion also deepens self-awareness. You learn to recognize when your motivations shift, when your curiosity moves in new directions. You become attentive to inner signals rather than relying solely on external expectations. Over time, endings lose their sharpness. They become part of the natural rhythm of life, as inevitable as beginnings. You stop resisting them and start cooperating with them. There is courage in allowing things to finish without forcing them to collapse first. It requires trust in your ability to navigate what comes after. It requires faith that meaning will continue to unfold. As you practice this courage, transitions become smoother. You leave situations with appreciation instead of regret. You enter new phases with openness instead of hesitation. Peace grows from this acceptance. You no longer feel compelled to hold everything together. You allow life to move, to shift, to transform without constant intervention. You also become more present in each phase, knowing that it will not last forever. This awareness deepens your appreciation while it exists, reducing the urge to prolong it artificially. Completion then becomes a form of wisdom. It teaches you when to stay and when to step away. It shows you that endings can be quiet and still be real. It reminds you that your life is not a single continuous line, but a series of evolving chapters. And in recognizing completion without catastrophe, you discover a gentler way of living. One that does not wait for things to break before allowing them to end. One that honors the natural cycle of growth, fulfillment, and release. You realize that stopping the effort to fix what is already complete is not abandonment, it is respect. Respect for the journey that has reached its destination, for the experiences that have given all they could, for the version of yourself that is ready to move forward, and in that respect, you find freedom. The freedom to close chapters with gratitude instead of fear, to walk away without needing a crisis, to trust that what is meant for you will continue to unfold as long as you are willing to let finished things remain finished. In the end, the deepest peace arrived the moment you stopped fighting life. When you loosened your grip on what was never meant to stay. When you stopped chasing what required constant force. When you allowed endings to be quiet instead of catastrophic. Something inside you finally rested. You saw that suffering was not created by loss, but by resistance. And that what truly belongs to you does not need to be begged for, repaired endlessly, or held together by exhaustion. Letting go was never about giving up. It was about coming home to yourself. If something in these reflections felt uncomfortably true, leave a comment with the word release. Not for anyone else to see, but as a quiet promise to yourself that you are ready to stop forcing what was never yours. And if you want more reflections that calm the mind, steady the heart, and help you move through life with quiet strength, subscribe to the channel and stay with us on this journey inward.